5,000 years ago, roughly 3,100 years before the Common Era, according to current archaeological estimates, someone built a tomb in the desert near the ancient Egyptian city of Naqada. The tomb was enormous. It measured roughly 53 meters long and 26 meters wide, larger than many of the royal tombs that would be built centuries later, larger than the tombs of officials and nobles, larger than anything that had been built in that region before. The tomb was lined with mud brick, hundreds of thousands of bricks, carefully laid in courses, forming walls that enclosed a series of chambers filled with offerings for the dead, stone vessels, ivory labels, ceramic jars sealed with clay stoppers, the kind of grave goods that were reserved in early Egypt for the most important members of society. The rulers, the priests, the figures who stood at the apex of a civilization that was, at that moment, in the process of being born. When the French archaeologist Jacques de Morgan excavated this tomb in 1897, he assumed it belonged to a king. The size demanded that conclusion. The quality of the grave goods confirmed it. The location, Naqada, one of the most important sites in Upper Egypt, supported it. Everything about the tomb said, this was a ruler. This was a person of supreme importance. This was someone who commanded the resources of a state, or a proto-state, and who was honored in death with the kind of monumental burial that only supreme authority could command. But the tomb did not belong to a king. It belonged to a queen. Her name was Neithhotep, and her name, inscribed on ivory labels and seal impressions found within the tomb, is one of the oldest royal names in all of Egyptian history. Not the oldest name of a king, the oldest name of a queen, a woman's name, written at the very threshold of recorded history, at the precise moment when the civilization we call ancient Egypt was emerging from the silence of prehistory into the light of the written record. The name itself is a statement. Neithhotep means Neith is satisfied, a name that invokes the goddess Neith, one of the most ancient and most powerful deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Neith was a goddess of Lower Egypt, of the delta, the marshy flatlands, where the Nile fans out into its many channels before reaching the Mediterranean Sea. She was a goddess of war and weaving, of hunting and creation, a deity so old that the Egyptians themselves considered her among the most primordial of their gods. By bearing the name of Neith, this queen was declaring an allegiance, a connection to Lower Egypt, to the delta, to a religious and political tradition that was distinct from the traditions of Upper Egypt, where her tomb was built. This matters because the period in which Neithhotep lived, the very beginning of the First Dynasty, the moment of Egypt's political unification, was the period when Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt were being forged into a single state. The unification of the two lands, the political merger of the narrow Nile Valley of Upper Egypt with the broad delta of Lower Egypt, was the founding act of Egyptian civilization. It was the event that created the state that would endure for 3,000 years, and Neithhotep, with her Lower Egyptian name and her Upper Egyptian tomb, may have been part of the mechanism by which that unification was achieved. A princess from the delta, married to a king from the south, her body sealing the political alliance that created the world's first great nation-state. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand the story of the woman who stands at the very beginning of recorded Egyptian history, a woman whose tomb was so large that it was mistaken for a king's. A woman whose name is among the first female names we can read in the entire human record, a woman who lived at the threshold, the precise and extraordinary boundary between the deep silence of prehistory and the first faint marks of writing, between the world that existed before Egypt and the extraordinary world that Egypt would go on to create, and a woman whose existence at that threshold tells us something profound about the role of women at the very foundation of one of the greatest civilizations in human history, something that the next 5,000 years of history would spend a remarkable amount of energy trying to forget. The tomb at Naqada is not merely an archaeological curiosity. It is a monument to the presence of female power at the very beginning of the Egyptian story. A monument that was built before the systems of erasure had been invented, before the conventions of patriarchal recording had been established, before anyone had decided that women's achievements were less worthy of permanent record than men's. The tomb is the baseline. Everything that came after it, every act of erasure, Every mechanism of forgetting is a departure from what was there at the start. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it genuinely and meaningfully helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand Neithhotep, you must first understand what the world looked like at the moment she lived. A moment so ancient, so remote from our own experience, that the effort of imagination required to reach it is itself a form of archaeology. We are talking about a period roughly 5,100 years ago, a period when the pyramids of Giza had not yet been imagined, when the great temples of Karnak and Luxor did not exist, when the hieroglyphic script that would become the hallmark of Egyptian civilization was in its earliest and most rudimentary form. We are talking about the very beginning. Not the beginning of Egyptian greatness, not the beginning of Egyptian power, but the beginning of Egypt itself. The moment when the political entity that we call ancient Egypt came into existence. The geography is essential. Egypt is, and has always been, two lands. The south, Upper Egypt, is a narrow ribbon of fertile land along the Nile, rarely more than a few kilometers wide, hemmed in on both sides by desert cliffs that rise sharply from the valley floor. The landscape is dramatic. Green fields giving way abruptly to barren sand and rock, the Nile flowing northward through a corridor of cultivation that is one of the most sharply defined ecological boundaries on Earth. Upper Egypt is a landscape of concentration, people, agriculture, and power compressed into a narrow strip of land that stretches for roughly 800 kilometers from the first cataract at modern Aswan to the apex of the delta near modern Cairo. The north, Lower Egypt, is entirely different. The delta is a vast, flat expanse of marshland and farmland, where the Nile divides into multiple channels before reaching the Mediterranean. The landscape is open, diffuse, and watery, a world of reeds and channels and low-lying islands, where the boundaries between land and water shift with the seasons, and where the density of settlement is spread across a much wider area than in the narrow valley to the south. Lower Egypt is a landscape of dispersal, a world where power is distributed rather than concentrated, where no single center dominates, and where the relationship between human communities and the natural environment is one of accommodation rather than conquest. The unification of these two lands, the political merger of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt into a single state governed by a single ruler, was the founding event of Egyptian civilization. The traditional account, preserved in the writings of later Egyptian historians and in the monumental art of the earliest dynasties, attributes the unification to a king from Upper Egypt, a ruler known as Narmer or Menes, depending on which source you consult and how you reconcile the conflicting traditions that surround the event. The Narmer palette, one of the most famous and most studied artifacts in all of Egyptian archaeology, a large ceremonial palette carved from greenish siltstone and discovered at the site of Hierakonpolis in 1898 by the British archaeologists James Quibell and Frederick Green, depicts a king wearing the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt, smiting his enemies with a mace, and presiding over scenes of military triumph and ritual domination. The palette is often interpreted as a commemoration of the unification, a visual record of the moment when the South conquered the North and forged the two lands into a single kingdom. But the unification was almost certainly more complex than a single military campaign or a single decisive battle. The archaeological evidence, drawn from decades of excavation at sites across both Upper and Lower Egypt, suggests a long process of political consolidation that extended over decades, perhaps centuries, and that involved not merely military conquest but trade, diplomacy, cultural exchange, and intermarriage between the ruling elites of the two regions. The Naqada culture, the archaeological culture of Upper Egypt that is named after the very site where Neithhotep's tomb was found, had been expanding its influence northward for centuries before the political unification was accomplished. The distinctive pottery, the stone vessels, the carved ivory objects, and the other material markers of the Naqada culture have been found at sites throughout the delta, evidence that the cultural unification of Egypt preceded the political unification, and that the relationship between North and South was one of gradual integration rather than sudden conquest. The predynastic period, the centuries that preceded the establishment of the First Dynasty, is one of the most fascinating and least understood periods in Egyptian history. The archaeological evidence reveals a world of competing chiefdoms and small kingdoms, each centered on a major site along the Nile: Hierakonpolis, Naqada, Abydos, and Thinis in the south, Buto, Sais, and Mardi in the north. These centers were connected by trade, the Nile itself being the great highway that linked every community along its banks, and by the exchange of prestige goods that served as markers of social status and political authority. The elites of these communities were buried with increasing elaboration over the centuries, their tombs growing larger, their grave goods growing more numerous and more exotic, their inscriptions growing more complex as the technology of writing was gradually developed. The emergence of writing in this context is itself a story of profound significance. The earliest Egyptian writing, the hieroglyphic signs that appear on pottery, on ivory labels, on seal impressions, and on the ceremonial objects of the late predynastic and early First Dynasty period, was not a fully developed script capable of recording continuous text. It was a system of notation, a practical way of marking ownership, recording individual names, identifying offerings, and establishing the relationships between people, places, and goods. The signs were pictographic in nature. They represented objects and concepts through images that could be recognized by anyone familiar with the convention. A falcon represented the god Horus. A reed and a bee represented Upper and Lower Egypt. A pair of crossed arrows and a shield represented the goddess Neith. The system was limited but powerful. It could capture names, titles, and relationships with a precision that oral tradition alone could not achieve. And it was in this system, this early, experimental, still evolving system of graphic notation, that Neithhotep's name was inscribed. The inscription of Neithhotep's name is significant not merely because it preserves the identity of an early queen, but because it demonstrates the priorities of the emerging Egyptian state. The writing system was new and unfamiliar. It was expensive to produce. The creation of inscribed objects required skilled craftsmen, specialized materials, and a level of social organization that was available only to the ruling elite. The decision to inscribe a specific name was therefore a deliberate and consequential decision about value. A judgment that this particular person, this particular identity, was important enough to warrant the investment of scarce resources in the creation of a permanent record. The fact that Neithhotep's name was inscribed tells us that the earliest Egyptian state considered its royal women fully worthy of this extraordinary and costly investment, that the identity of royal women was, from the very beginning, something that the state wished to preserve. This is where Neithhotep enters the story. Her name, invoking the goddess Neith of Lower Egypt, and her tomb, located in Upper Egypt at the site of Naqada, suggest that she was a woman who bridged the two lands. The most widely accepted interpretation among scholars is that Neithhotep was a princess from Lower Egypt, a member of the ruling elite of the Delta, who was married to a king from Upper Egypt as part of the political process that accomplished the unification. The marriage would have served a dual purpose: cementing a diplomatic alliance between the two regions and producing an heir whose bloodline connected both the north and the south, a child who could claim legitimate authority in both lands, and who could therefore rule the unified state with the consent of both populations. The identity of Neithhotep's husband is debated by scholars and remains one of the unresolved questions of early dynastic studies. Some scholars identify him as Narmer, the king who is most commonly credited with the military dimension of the unification, and whose name appears on the famous palette from Hierakonpolis. Others identify him as Hor-Aha, the king who succeeded Narmer and who may have been Neithhotep's son rather than her husband, a possibility that would make Neithhotep a queen mother rather than a great royal wife. A third possibility is that Neithhotep was married to Narmer and served as regent for the young Hor-Aha after Narmer's death, a hypothesis that would explain both the enormous size of her tomb, which reflects the resources available to a regent who controlled the state, and the inscriptional evidence that links her name to both Narmer and Hor-Aha. The debate is not merely academic. It matters because the answer determines what kind of power Neithhotep wielded, whether she was a consort whose importance derived from her husband, a mother whose importance derived from her son, or a regent whose importance derived from her own exercise of sovereign authority during the minority of a young king. Each possibility has different implications for our understanding of female power at the foundation of the Egyptian state. If Neithhotep was a regent, if she governed Egypt during the early years of Aha's reign, making decisions about military campaigns, diplomatic relationships, and the administration of a newly unified state, then her role was even more extraordinary than the tomb alone suggests. She would have been not merely a queen, but a ruler, a woman who exercised sovereign authority at the very beginning of Egyptian history, before the conventions that would later restrict female political authority had been established. The discovery of Neithhotep's tomb is a story that reveals the assumptions of the excavators as clearly as it reveals the identity of the deceased. Jacques de Morgan was one of the most energetic and most ambitious archaeologists working in Egypt in the closing years of the 19th century. He had been appointed Director General of the Egyptian Antiquity Service in 1892, a position of extraordinary authority that gave him supervisory control over all archaeological excavations conducted in the country. De Morgan was an extraordinarily prolific excavator. He conducted ambitious archaeological campaigns at numerous sites across Egypt, with a pace and a scale of operation that later archaeologists would criticize as hasty and sometimes destructive, but that also generated an enormous body of archaeological data that continues to inform scholarly research more than a century later. When De Morgan excavated the tomb at Naqada in 1897, he approached it with the natural assumption that a tomb of such monumental proportions must belong to a king. The assumption reflected not merely the personal biases of a 19th century European male, but the entire prevailing conceptual framework of the archaeology of his particular era, a framework in which political power was associated with masculinity, in which monumental architecture was interpreted as evidence of male authority, and in which the possibility that a woman might command the resources necessary to build a tomb of royal dimensions was simply not part of the analytical vocabulary. De Morgan labelled the tomb a royal burial and moved on to other excavations, leaving the detailed analysis of the inscriptions to later scholars who would eventually identify the tomb's occupant as a queen. The identification of the tomb's true occupant came through the meticulous and painstaking study of the ivory labels and clay seal impressions found within the tomb. These small objects, some of them barely larger than a thumbnail, bore inscriptions in the early hieroglyphic script that included the name Neithhotep, written with the signs for the goddess Neith and the word Hotep, meaning satisfied or at peace. The name appeared in a format that was similar to, but not identical with, the serekh, the rectangular frame that was used in early Egyptian writing to enclose the names of kings. The use of a serekh-like frame for a queen's name was unusual. It suggested a level of status that exceeded the conventional markers of queenly identity, and that approached, or perhaps equaled, the status of the king himself. The realization that this enormous tomb belonged to a queen should have been a watershed moment in the study of early Egyptian civilization. It should have prompted a fundamental reconsideration of the assumptions about gender and power that had shaped the interpretation of early dynastic archaeology. It should have generated a sustained discussion about the role of women at the foundation of the Egyptian state, a discussion that would have placed Neithhotep at the center of the narrative rather than at its margins. Instead, the identification was noted, published, and largely set aside, absorbed into the broader narrative of early dynastic Egypt as an interesting but peripheral detail rather than as the revolutionary discovery that it was. The serekh, the rectangular frame used to enclose the names of kings, is one of the most important elements of early Egyptian royal iconography, and its association with Neithhotep's name is a detail of considerable significance. In the fully developed form of the hieroglyphic writing system, the serekh was used exclusively for the Horus name of the king. the name that identified the ruler as the living incarnation of the sky god Horus, and that was the most important of the 5 names that constituted the full royal titulary. The serekh was shaped like the facade of a palace, a rectangular frame decorated with a pattern of recessed panels that evoked the architecture of the royal residence, and it was surmounted by the falcon of Horus, the divine bird that represented the god, whose incarnation the king was believed to be. The use of a serekh or serekh-like frame beneath Neithhotep's name is unusual because it suggests a level of status that was normally reserved for kings, a level that placed Neithhotep not merely among the royal family, but at the very apex of the political hierarchy, in the position normally occupied by the male ruler himself. The significance of this detail has been debated by scholars. Some have argued that the serekh-like frame indicates that Neithhotep was recognized as a ruler in her own right, that she exercised sovereign authority, and was therefore entitled to the same iconographic markers of supreme status that were used for kings. Others have argued that the frame is a variant of the serekh, similar in form but different in meaning, indicating high status without claiming full sovereign authority. The debate is complicated by the fact that the conventions and formal rules of early Egyptian writing were still in the active process of development. The rigid and inflexible distinctions between royal and non-royal inscriptional formats that would characterize the more bureaucratically organized later periods of Egyptian history had not yet been fully established, and the use of the serekh-like frame for a queen's name may reflect a flexibility in early Egyptian inscriptional practice that later periods would not tolerate. Regardless of the precise interpretation, the inscriptional evidence confirms that Neithhotep occupied a position of extraordinary status in the earliest Egyptian state, a position that was, at the very least, comparable to the position of the king, and that may have been, in functional terms, indistinguishable from it. The inscriptions are not ambiguous about Neithhotep's importance. They are ambiguous only about the precise nature of the importance, whether it derived from her role as a wife, a mother, a regent, or a sovereign. The ambiguity is frustrating for modern scholars who would prefer clear and definitive answers. But the ambiguity is also, in its own way, informative, because it tells us that the earliest Egyptian state had not yet developed the rigid categories and the strict hierarchies that would later define the relationship between king and queen, between male authority and female authority, between the serekh of the ruler and the absence of a serekh for everyone else. The pattern of scholarly neglect is itself a form of erasure, a modern echo of the ancient patterns that this series has documented across 3,000 years of Egyptian history. The tomb was there, the inscriptions were there, the evidence for female power at the foundation of the Egyptian state was there, but the assumptions of the scholars who studied the evidence were not equipped to give it the significance it deserved, because the scholars, like the ancient recording systems they studied, operated within a framework that associated political power with masculinity and that treated female power as exceptional, marginal, and ultimately unimportant. The question of Neithhotep's political role, whether she was a consort, a regent, or a ruler in her own right, connects to a broader question about the nature of political authority in the earliest Egyptian state. The concept of kingship in the early First Dynasty was not the same as the concept of kingship that would develop in later periods. The pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, the god king, who built the pyramids of Giza, who commanded armies of tens of thousands, who administered a centralized bureaucracy that controlled the economic life of millions, did not yet exist. The rulers of the First Dynasty were something different. Powerful chieftains who were in the process of creating the institutions of centralized authority, who were experimenting with the mechanisms of state power, and who had not yet established the rigid conventions and hierarchies that would characterize the mature Egyptian state. In this context, the boundaries between the roles of king and queen, between the authority of the ruler and the authority of the ruler's spouse, may have been more fluid and more permeable than they would later become. The archaeological evidence from other First Dynasty sites supports this interpretation. The subsidiary burials that surround the royal tombs at Abydos, Graves of retainers who were interred alongside their ruler, presumably to serve them in the afterlife, are found at the tombs of both kings and queens, suggesting that the practice of retainer sacrifice was associated with supreme political authority, rather than with male authority specifically. The grave goods in the earliest royal tombs include objects of both Upper Egyptian and Lower Egyptian origin, confirming that the unified state maintained connections to both regions and that the rulers and their consorts were expected to embody the dual identity of the two lands. The dual crown, the pshent, the combination of the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, was being developed during this period as the visual symbol of unified authority, and its association with both the king and the queen mother reinforces the interpretation that political authority in the earliest period was shared, or at least distributed, between the male ruler and the senior female members of the royal house. The role of the queen mother in early dynastic Egypt deserves particular emphasis because it provides the most plausible explanation for Neithhotep's extraordinary status. In many early states, not just Egypt but Mesopotamia, the Aegean, and sub-Saharan Africa, the mother of the king held a position of institutional importance that was distinct from and sometimes superior to the position of the king's wife. The queen mother was the guarantor of legitimacy, the woman whose body had produced the heir, whose bloodline connected the new king to the royal lineage, and whose continued presence at court provided a bridge of continuity between one reign and the next. If Neithhotep was the mother of Hor-Aha, if she bore the first king of the unified dynasty, and then governed the state during his minority, then her extraordinary tomb and her prominent inscriptions become not merely understandable but expected. She was not merely a queen, she was the queen mother, the woman who had produced the dynasty's heir, who had governed the state in his name, and who was honoured in death with a burial that reflected the full measure of her institutional importance. The geography of the tomb's location adds another dimension to the interpretation. Naqada was one of the most important centres of Upper Egyptian culture during the pre-dynastic period, a city that had been a major political and economic centre for centuries before the unification. The decision to build Neithhotep's tomb at Naqada rather than at Abydos, where the other First Dynasty kings were buried, may reflect the specific political circumstances of the early unification. If Neithhotep was indeed a Lower Egyptian princess married to an Upper Egyptian king, then her burial at Naqada may represent a deliberate political choice, a statement that the queen of the unified state would be honoured in one of the great centres of Upper Egyptian power, demonstrating that the North and the South were truly one kingdom, and that the queen, who embodied the union between them, would be honoured in the heartland of the dynasty that had achieved it. The tomb's orientation, its internal layout, and the distribution of offerings within its chambers all provide clues about the religious beliefs and ritual practices of the earliest Egyptian state. Beliefs and practices that were still being formulated and that would evolve significantly over the following centuries. The chambers were arranged to accommodate specific categories of offerings: food and drink for the sustenance of the deceased in the afterlife, stone vessels and ivory objects for use in the eternal realm, and inscribed labels that identified the offerings and their donors. The arrangement suggests a conception of the afterlife that was already well developed, a belief that the dead required material sustenance, that the living had an obligation to provide it, and that the quality and quantity of the offerings reflected the status and importance of the deceased. The fact that Neithhotep received offerings of this quality and in this quantity confirms that she was regarded as a person of the highest possible status, a person whose needs and requirements in the afterlife were considered as great as those of a king, and who was therefore honoured with a burial that was indistinguishable in its scale and its elaboration from the burials of kings. The religious dimension of the unification has been understudied relative to the military dimension, partly because the surviving evidence for actual religious practices and ritual procedures in the early First Dynasty is considerably more difficult to interpret than the evidence for military campaigns, and partly because the scholarly tradition has tended to privilege the political and military aspects of state formation. over the religious and cultural aspects. But the religious dimension was almost certainly as important as the political dimension, and may, in some respects, have been more important. The unification of Egypt required not merely the military conquest of the north by the south, but the integration of two distinct religious traditions into a single coherent system that could command the loyalty and the devotion of the entire population. The goddess Neith of the Delta and the god Horus of Heracompolis had to be reconciled. The priesthoods of the north and the south had to be harmonized. The ritual practices of the two regions had to be merged into a unified religious system that honored both traditions without subordinating either. Neithhotep, the woman whose name invoked the principal goddess of the north, and whose marriage to a southern king embodied the union of the two lands, was almost certainly a participant in this process of religious reconciliation, a living symbol of the theological merger that accompanied and legitimized the political unification. The broader context of early Egyptian religion adds further depth to the interpretation of Neithhotep's tomb and her relationship to the goddess whose name she bore. The religious landscape of early dynastic Egypt was different from the highly organized and centrally administered temple system that would characterize later periods. The earliest Egyptian religion was a patchwork of local cults, each community worshipping its own particular patron deity or set of deities, each center maintaining its own priesthood and its own ritual traditions. The goddess Neith was the patron of Sais and the surrounding delta region, a powerful local deity whose cult would later be incorporated into the broader Egyptian religious system, but who was, at the time of Neithhotep's life, primarily associated with the political and cultural traditions of Lower Egypt. Neithhotep's name thus placed her within a specific religious tradition, the tradition of Neith worship in the Delta, and her marriage to an Upper Egyptian king represented not merely a political alliance between two ruling houses, but a religious alliance between two cultic traditions, a merger of the sacred as well as the secular. The combined evidence, the tomb, the inscriptions, the serekh-like name frame, the scale and quality of the grave goods, paints a picture of a woman who occupied the highest possible position in the earliest Egyptian state. Whether that position was that of a consort, a regent, or a sovereign in her own right remains debated. But the debate itself is revealing, because the very fact that scholars cannot agree on the precise nature of Neithhotep's authority suggests that the boundaries between these categories were not yet firmly established in the early First Dynasty. The core problem of Neithhotep's story is the threshold. She stands at the very edge of the written record, the boundary between prehistory and history, between the silence of the unrecorded past and the first faint and tentative marks of writing that would eventually grow into the vast and magnificent archive of Egyptian civilization. She is not a woman who was erased from the record. She is a woman who exists at the beginning of the record, one of the first women whose name was written down, one of the first women who crossed the threshold from the anonymous darkness of the pre-literate world into the fragile light of the inscribed word. The threshold matters because everything that came after it, every act of erasure, every form of forgetting, every mechanism by which women's achievements were lost or distorted or diminished over the following 5,000 years, presupposes a record. The chisel that cut Hatshepsut's name from the stone could only operate on a name that had been carved there in the first place. The silence that consumed Tai-Merenisset's biography could only exist in a system that was capable of recording biographies but chose not to record hers. The narrative that replaced Cleopatra with a Roman caricature could only function in a literary culture that produced narratives. The abstraction that dissolved Berenice into a constellation could only work on a woman who had first been made concrete through poetry and coinage. The absorption that consumed Arsinoe within her own institutional innovations could only occur in a system complex enough to have institutions in the first place. Every form of erasure documented in this series requires, as its precondition, the existence of a record, a writing system, an inscriptive tradition, a culture of documentation that is capable of preserving information and therefore capable of losing it. Neithhotep stands before the record. She stands at the moment when the record is being created. when the hieroglyphic script is in its earliest form, when the conventions of royal documentation are being established for the first time, when the very idea of writing down a name and preserving it for posterity is still new, still experimental, still uncertain, and the crucial fact that her name was among the very first to be written, that a woman's name was inscribed at the very threshold of Egyptian literacy, tells us something extraordinary about the status of women at the foundation of Egyptian civilization. Women were there. Women were important. Women were considered worthy of the extraordinary effort and expense that early writing required. The carving of ivory labels, the pressing of clay seal impressions, the creation of permanent records in a culture where the ability to create permanent records was itself a genuinely revolutionary innovation in human communication. But here is the problem. The threshold is also a wall. The record that begins with Neithhotep is a record that was created by a specific culture for specific purposes, using specific conventions that reflected specific assumptions about what was worth recording and what was not. The record was not designed to preserve the full complexity of women's lives. It was designed to preserve the names, titles, and ritual functions of the ruling elite, to maintain the genealogical and theological continuity of the state, to record the offerings that were due to the dead, and to establish the relationships between the living and the divine. The record could accommodate a queen's name. It could not accommodate a queen's biography. It could preserve a title. It could not preserve a personality. It could inscribe a relationship, wife of, mother of, daughter of, but it could not inscribe a life. Neithhotep's name survives. Her life does not. We know what she was called. We do not know what she thought, what she felt, what she experienced, what she accomplished beyond the bare fact of her existence as a royal woman of extraordinary status. We know she was buried in a tomb of royal proportions. We do not know who built it, whether she commissioned it herself, whether her husband ordered its construction, whether her son built it in her memory. We know she was associated with the goddess Neith. We do not know the nature of that association, whether she was a priestess, a devotee, a woman who simply bore the goddess's name as a marker of her geographic and political origins. We know she existed at the threshold. We do not know what she saw when she looked across it. And it gets worse, because the threshold that Neithhotep stands at is not merely the threshold between prehistory and history. It is the threshold between a world in which women's power was, apparently, taken for granted, so obvious, so fundamental, so deeply embedded in the structure of society that it did not need to be argued for or defended, and a world in which women's power would be increasingly constrained, contested, and erased. The tomb at Naqada tells us that a woman could command royal burial at the very beginning of Egyptian civilization. The next 5,000 years of Egyptian history tell us that this level of female power and visibility was not maintained, that the recording system that began by inscribing women's names would, over the centuries, develop conventions and biases that systematically diminished the visibility of women in the historical record. The predynastic antecedents of Neithhotep's status deserve further exploration because they reveal the deep roots of female power in the rich and complex cultures that preceded the establishment of the unified Egyptian state. The archaeological evidence from predynastic Upper Egypt, from the sophisticated Naqada culture that dominated the Upper Egyptian Nile Valley in the centuries before the unification, includes female burials of considerable elaboration. At the site of Hierakonpolis, one of the most important political centers of predynastic Upper Egypt, excavations have revealed elite burials that include both male and female individuals interred, with grave goods of exceptional quality. The female burials at Hierakonpolis and other predynastic sites include cosmetic palettes, stone vessels, elaborate jewelry crafted from shell, bone, and semi-precious stone, and other objects that indicate high social status and access to the prestige goods networks that connected the communities of the Nile Valley. The cosmetic palettes are particularly significant because they are among the most distinctive artifacts of predynastic Egyptian culture, and because their evolution from simple utilitarian objects to elaborate ceremonial items traces the development of elite culture in the centuries before the unification. The earliest palettes were simple stone slabs used for grinding minerals into cosmetic pigments, particularly galena and malachite, which were used as eye paint for both practical and ritual purposes. Over time, the palettes became larger, more elaborately shaped, and more intricately decorated, eventually evolving into the monumental ceremonial palettes of the late predynastic and early First Dynasty period, of which the Narmer palette is the most famous example. The association of palettes with female burials in the predynastic period suggests that the cosmetic and ritual practices associated with these objects were, at least in part, within the female sphere of activity, a sphere that included not merely personal adornment but participation in the ritual life of the community. The connection between predynastic female burials and the monumental tomb of Neithhotep at Naqada is not merely geographic, Naqada being one of the most important predynastic sites in Upper Egypt. It is cultural. The tradition of honoring elite women with elaborate burials and high-quality grave goods was an established and well-attested feature of Upper Egyptian culture for centuries before the unification, and was not an innovation of the First Dynasty but a continuation of an existing practice. Neithhotep's tomb is extraordinary in its scale, but its underlying principle, the principle that a powerful woman deserved an honorable burial with appropriate grave goods, was deeply rooted in the culture of the region. The First Dynasty did not invent the practice of honoring powerful women. It inherited the practice, and it expressed it on a scale that was commensurate with the vastly greater resources that the unified state could command. The question of what the grave goods in Neithhotep's tomb tell us about her daily life, about her activities, her responsibilities, her relationships with the people around her, is a question that the evidence can only partially answer. The stone vessels may have been used in ritual contexts, for the preparation and presentation of offerings to the gods, or for the storage of precious oils and unguents that were used in religious ceremonies. The ivory labels recorded the contents of containers and the identities of offerings, suggesting a bureaucratic dimension to the burial that reflects the administrative practices of the early state. The seal impressions indicate the exercise of administrative authority, the use of seals to authenticate documents, to control access to stored goods, and to establish the identity and authority of the person whose seal was used. If the cylinder seals found within Neithhotep's tomb were indeed her own personal seals, if she personally used them to seal documents and to authorize transactions, then they are direct evidence of her participation in the administrative life of the state, powerful and direct evidence that she was not merely a ceremonial or decorative figure in the Ptolemaic court, but an active and substantive participant in the daily governance of the newly unified kingdom. The evidence from the tomb also raises questions about the elaborate funerary rituals that would have accompanied Neithhotep's burial, rituals that would have been among the most important religious ceremonies of the early First Dynasty, and that would have involved the participation of the king, the priesthood, and the entire court. The burial of a person of Neithhotep's extraordinary and possibly supreme status would not have been a modest or private event. It would have been a state ceremony, a public demonstration of the dynasty's power, piety, and continuity, attended by officials from across the kingdom and accompanied by rituals that connected the living to the dead and the earthly to the divine. The ceremony would have included the placement of offerings in the tomb chambers, the sealing of the chambers with mud brick walls, and the performance of ritual actions designed to ensure the deceased's successful transition to the afterlife. The specifics of these rituals are not recorded. The still developing writing system of the early First Dynasty was not yet capable of recording the kind of complex and elaborate liturgical texts that would characterize later Egyptian funerary practice, but their existence can be inferred from the archaeological evidence of the tomb itself, and from the well-documented continuity of funerary practice and ritual tradition across the subsequent centuries of Egyptian history. The trajectory is clear. At the beginning, at the threshold, women were visible. Their names were inscribed. Their tombs were built to royal specifications. Their existence was recorded with the same care and prominence that was given to the names of kings. By the end, by the time of the much later Ptolemaic dynasty, by the time of the Hellenistic queens we have examined in the previous episodes of this series. Women's visibility had been drastically reduced. Their achievements were erased, distorted, abstracted, or absorbed. Their names survived, but their stories did not. The recording system that had begun by including women had, over the course of 3 millennia, developed mechanisms for excluding them, not through a single act of malice, but through the slow, gradual, cumulative effect of cultural assumptions and institutional practices that valued male achievement over female achievement, male power over female power, and male stories over female stories. Neithhotep is the baseline. She is the starting point, the evidence of what was, before the systems of erasure began to operate, and the distance between Neithhotep's tomb at Naqada and the silence that surrounds the lives of later Egyptian queens is the distance that this series has been measuring, the distance between what women were and what the record allows us to know about them. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The silence that surrounds Neithhotep is not the same kind of silence that surrounds the later queens. The silence around Hatshepsut is the silence of deliberate erasure, names chiseled from stone, images defaced, a reign systematically removed from the official record. The silence around Ty-Mereniset is the silence of structural indifference, a recording system that simply did not consider her life worth documenting. The silence around Neithhotep is something else entirely. It is the silence of the threshold itself. The silence that exists not because information was destroyed or ignored, but because the tools for creating and preserving information were not yet fully developed. The writing system was in its infancy. The conventions of royal documentation were being established for the first time. The very concept of a historical record, of a systematic, ongoing archive of human events, did not yet exist in the form it would later take. Neithhotep's silence is the silence of the beginning, the silence that precedes the record rather than the silence that follows its destruction. And this form of silence is, in many ways, the most poignant of all, because it reminds us that the vast majority of human experience, across the vast majority of human history, was never recorded at all. The women and men who lived before the invention of writing, the millions of human beings who built communities, raised children, developed technologies, created art, told stories, and shaped the world they inhabited, left no written record of their lives. They are not forgotten. They were never remembered, because the mechanisms of remembering had not yet been invented. Neithhotep stands at the boundary between these two worlds, the world of the unrecorded and the world of the inscribed. She is the first woman to cross that boundary, and the fact that she crossed it, that her name was written, that her tomb was built, that her existence was deemed worthy of permanent record, is itself a statement about the value that the earliest Egyptian civilization placed on its women. Something is wrong with our assumptions when a civilization that began by honoring its women with royal burials and inscribed names ended by erasing their achievements, distorting their legacies, and absorbing their innovations into systems that no longer bore their creators' names. Something changed, something was lost, and the distance between Neithhotep's tomb at Naqada and the silence that surrounds the lives of later Egyptian queens is the measure of that loss, the measure of what was sacrificed over 3,000 years of gradual institutional evolution to the demands of a recording system that valued men's stories over women's stories, and that preserved the names of kings while forgetting the names of the queens who stood beside them. The evidence from the early dynastic period, the period immediately following the unification, the period in which Neithhotep lived, suggests that the earliest Egyptian state granted its royal women a degree of visibility and institutional importance that would not be consistently maintained in later periods. Neithhotep is not the only early queen whose name and burial suggest extraordinary status. Neith, a queen of the First Dynasty who may have been the wife of King Jet and the mother of King Den, was buried at the royal cemetery of Abydos in a tomb that was included in the sequence of royal tombs, surrounded by subsidiary burials of the type that were reserved for the retainers of kings. Neith's tomb is significant because its inclusion in the royal sequence suggests that she was regarded as a ruler in her own right. Not merely a consort, but a sovereign, a woman who exercised the kind of authority that was normally associated with the male pharaoh. Her name appears on a seal impression from the tomb of her son Den that lists the kings of the First Dynasty sequence, and Neith is included in the list in the position that corresponds to her presumed period of regency, as if she were a king among kings. The pattern is suggestive. At the very beginning of Egyptian history, at the threshold, before the conventions of the recording system had been fully established, royal women were visible, powerful, and institutionally prominent. Their names were inscribed. Their tombs were built to royal standards. Their authority was recognized in the official records of the state. The earliest Egyptian civilization did not merely tolerate female power, it institutionalized it, giving women of the royal house the same kinds of monumental burials, the same kinds of inscriptional recognition, and the same kinds of ritual honors that were given to the kings themselves. The question that Neithhotep's story forces us to ask is, what happened? What changed between the threshold and the later periods that this series has documented? How did a civilization that began by honoring its women with royal tombs and inscribed names evolve into a civilization that erased Hatshepsut's cartouches, ignored Ti-Mereniset's biography, distorted Cleopatra's legacy, abstracted Berenice into a constellation, and absorbed Arsinoe into the institutions she created? The answer is not simple. It is not a story of a single event or a single decision. It is a story of gradual change, of slow, cumulative shifts in cultural assumptions, institutional practices, and recording conventions that over the course of 3 millennia produced a recording system that was systematically less hospitable to women's achievements than the system that had existed at the beginning. The shift was not uniform. There were periods of greater female visibility and periods of lesser, peaks and troughs in the long arc of women's presence in the Egyptian record. The 18th dynasty, the dynasty of Hatshepsut, was a period of extraordinary female visibility, with powerful queens like Neithhotep, Ahmose-Nefertari, and Hatshepsut herself exercising forms of authority that were unprecedented in the immediately preceding periods. The Ptolemaic period, the period of Arsinoe, Berenice, and Cleopatra, was another peak, with the innovations of Arsinoe II creating a framework for female power that was, in institutional terms, the most comprehensive in Egyptian history. But the peaks were always followed by troughs, by periods of reaction, of restriction, of the gradual reimposition of conventions that limited women's visibility and constrained their political authority. And the long-term trajectory, when viewed across the full and enormous span of Egyptian history from the First Dynasty to the Ptolemaic period, was unmistakably one of diminishment, a slow, irregular, but persistent reduction in the visibility and institutional prominence of royal women in the Egyptian record. The reduction was not the result of a conspiracy or a deliberate policy of exclusion. It was the product of institutional evolution, the gradual development of recording conventions, administrative practices, and cultural assumptions that, taken individually, seemed neutral and unremarkable, but that, taken collectively, produced a system that was increasingly hostile to the preservation of women's achievements. The material evidence from Neithhotep's tomb provides a baseline against which this trajectory of diminishment can be measured. The tomb is roughly 53 meters long and 26 meters wide, dimensions that place it among the largest tombs of the early First Dynasty, and that exceed the dimensions of many later royal tombs. The tomb was constructed of mud brick, the standard building material of the period, with walls that were built to substantial thickness and that enclosed a series of chambers designed to hold the offerings and grave goods that would sustain the deceased in the afterlife. The grave goods included stone vessels of exceptional quality, carved from hard stones like diorite and basalt, with a precision that demonstrates the high level of craft skill available to the early dynastic elite. Ivory labels, small tablets inscribed with early hieroglyphic signs, recorded the identity of the tomb's occupant and the nature of the offerings that were placed within it. Seal impressions, clay sealings that bore the impressions of carved cylinder seals, provided additional inscriptional evidence for the identity and status of the deceased. The quality and quantity of these grave goods are significant because they reflect the resources that were available to the person who was buried in the tomb, and the willingness of the state to invest those resources in the burial of a woman. In the early First Dynasty, the construction of a monumental tomb was not a private initiative. It was a state project, requiring the mobilization of labor, the allocation of materials, and the supervision of skilled craftsmen whose services were controlled by the central administration. The decision to build a tomb of this size for a queen was therefore a decision made at the highest level of the state, a decision that reflected the state's assessment of the queen's importance and its commitment to preserving her identity and her status for eternity. The ivory labels deserve particular attention because they represent one of the earliest forms of writing in Egyptian history, and because the information they contain, however fragmentary, provides a window into the world of the very first Egyptian queens. The labels are small, typically a few centimeters in length, and they bear inscriptions in the earliest hieroglyphic script, a script that was still in the process of development, and that lacked many of the conventions that would make later Egyptian writing relatively systematic and legible. The signs on the labels are pictographic. They represent objects, animals, and abstract concepts through images that are recognizable but that do not always convey their meaning with the precision that later scripts would achieve. The reading of these labels is therefore an exercise in interpretation, a process of comparing signs, identifying patterns, and constructing hypotheses about meaning that are always tentative and always subject to revision as new evidence is discovered. The labels from Neithhotep's tomb include her name, written with the signs for Neith, the crossed arrows and shield that represent the goddess, and Hotep, the offering table that represents satisfaction or peace. The combination is clear. Neith is satisfied, Neith is at peace, a name that invokes the protection and approval of one of the most ancient and most powerful goddesses in the Egyptian pantheon. The name is a theological statement as much as a personal identifier. It declares a relationship between the queen and the goddess, a relationship that confers divine legitimacy on the bearer, and that connects her to the religious traditions of Lower Egypt, the northern region that was being incorporated into the unified state at the time of her marriage. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The very system of writing that preserved Neithhotep's name, the hieroglyphic script that was being developed in the early First Dynasty, would become, over the course of the following 3 millennia, the instrument of women's erasure. The script that began by inscribing women's names would develop conventions that prioritized men's names. The recording system that began by documenting women's burials with the same care it devoted to men's would develop practices that documented men's achievements more thoroughly and more prominently than women's. The technology that began as a tool for preserving identity would become, through the slow accumulation of cultural biases and institutional conventions, a tool for selective preservation, preserving what the culture valued and discarding what it did not. And what the culture increasingly did not value, what it increasingly failed to record with the thoroughness and the prominence that the evidence warranted, was the lives and achievements of women. The comparison between Neithhotep's tomb and the burials of later Egyptian queens illustrates the trajectory of diminishment with painful clarity. In the Old Kingdom, the period of the Great Pyramids, roughly 500 years after Neithhotep, the queens were buried in smaller pyramids, adjacent to the massive pyramids of their husbands. The queens' pyramids were substantial structures, far larger than the tombs of ordinary officials, but they were visibly and intentionally subordinate to the king's pyramid, positioned alongside it rather than equal to it, designed to reflect the queen's importance while maintaining the unmistakable primacy of the male ruler. The architectural relationship between the king's pyramid and the queen's pyramid was a physical statement about the political relationship between king and queen. A statement that the queen was important but secondary, honored but subordinate, visible but always in the shadow of the male ruler. In the New Kingdom, the period of the Valley of the Kings, roughly 1500 years after Neithhotep. The queens were buried in a separate valley entirely, the Valley of the Queens. Located near the Valley of the Kings, but distinct from it, was the designated burial ground for royal women. The tombs in the Valley of the Queens were smaller than those in the Valley of the Kings. They were less elaborately decorated. They were less prominently located. The separation was physical and symbolic. The queens were literally removed from the company of the kings, placed in a different valley, buried in different tombs, honored with different rituals. The architectural message was clear. The queens were not the equals of the kings. They were not buried alongside them. They were set apart, respected but diminished, honored but segregated, remembered but in a lesser register than the male rulers who dominated the main valley. The contrast with Neithhotep's tomb at Naqada is dramatic. Neithhotep was not buried in a smaller structure adjacent to her husband's tomb. She was buried in a tomb that rivaled or exceeded the tombs of contemporary kings in size and elaboration. She was not segregated. She was not subordinated. She was not placed in a secondary position or a separate precinct. She was buried with the same scale, the same quality of grave goods, and the same level of inscriptional recognition that characterized the burials of the male rulers of her era. The beginning was measurably and demonstrably different from what followed. The threshold was wider than the door that succeeded it, and the narrowing of the door, the gradual reduction in the scale, the visibility, and the institutional prominence of royal women's burials is the physical expression of the broader trajectory of diminishment that this series has documented across 3,000 years of Egyptian history. The question of regency provides another lens through which to examine this trajectory. If Neithhotep served as regent for the young king Aha, governing the state during his minority, making decisions about military campaigns and diplomatic relationships, and the administration of a newly unified kingdom, then she exercised a form of authority that was, in functional terms, indistinguishable from kingship. A regent governs, a regent makes decisions, a regent exercises the full range of sovereign authority on behalf of a king who is too young to exercise it himself. The regent is, in practice, the ruler, the person who holds the reins of power and who is responsible for the functioning of the state. If Neithhotep was a regent, then the very first generation of the unified Egyptian state included a woman who governed as a ruler, a woman whose authority was supreme, whose decisions were final, and whose name was inscribed in the record alongside the names of the kings she served. The regency hypothesis has implications that extend beyond Neithhotep herself. If the earliest Egyptian state accommodated female regency, if the concept of a woman governing the state during the minority of a young king was not merely tolerated but institutionally supported and publicly acknowledged, then the later instances of female regency and female rulership that this series has documented are not anomalies. They are continuations, echoes of an original practice that was established at the very foundation of the state and that persisted, in various forms and with varying degrees of visibility, throughout the entire span of Egyptian history. Hatshepsut's regency-turned-kingship in the 18th dynasty, Tawaret's assumption of pharaonic titles at the end of the 19th dynasty, Merneith's apparent regency in the First Dynasty itself. All of these can be understood as instances of a pattern that was established at the beginning and that was never entirely abandoned, even when the recording system failed to document it with the thoroughness and prominence it deserved. The trajectory from Neithhotep to the queens of this series is the trajectory of that transformation, the slow, gradual, cumulative, and largely unconscious development of a recording system that was increasingly tilted against the preservation of women's stories. The tilt was not deliberate. It was structural, embedded in the conventions of the script, the practices of the scribes, the assumptions of the administrators, and the priorities of the kings who commissioned the records. The tilt was so gradual that no single generation noticed it. Each generation inherited the conventions of its predecessors and modified them slightly, in ways that seemed natural and unremarkable, and the cumulative effect of these modifications was a system that, by the end of Egyptian history, was dramatically less hospitable to women's achievements than the system that had existed at the beginning. The threshold was a moment of possibility, a moment when the conventions had not yet hardened into rigidity, when the categories had not yet been permanently fixed, when the newly created recording system was still flexible and open enough to accommodate the full and complete range of human achievement, regardless of the gender of the achiever. Neithhotep lived in that moment. She benefited from that flexibility. Her name was inscribed, her tomb was built, her existence was preserved for 5,000 years, and the very preservation of her name and her tomb is the most powerful evidence we possess that the subsequent restriction of women's visibility was not a feature of the original institutional design, but rather a later and culturally contingent development, a cultural choice that was made, gradually and cumulatively, over the course of the centuries and millennia that followed the threshold. And the measure of what was sacrificed is itself the measure of what must be recovered, one name at a time, one tomb at a time, one documentary at a time, until the record begins to reflect what the threshold proved was there from the very beginning. Neithhotep's story opens a window onto the earliest period of Egyptian civilization, a period so remote that the familiar landmarks of Egyptian history have not yet appeared. There are no pyramids, there are no great temples, there are no painted tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The Sphinx does not yet exist. The hieroglyphic script is in its infancy, a system of notation rather than a fully developed writing system, capable of recording names and titles, but not yet capable of recording the narratives, the hymns, the letters, and the administrative documents that would later constitute the vast archive of Egyptian civilization. The world of Neithhotep is a world at the beginning, a world where everything that we associate with ancient Egypt is still being invented. The first exploration places Neithhotep within the broader context of early dynastic royal women, the queens and queen mothers of the First and Second Dynasties whose names and tombs survive in the archaeological record and who collectively demonstrate that female power was a structural feature of the earliest Egyptian state. Neith is the most important of these early queens, a woman whose tomb at Abydos and whose inclusion in the royal sequence on a seal impression from the tomb of King Den suggests that she exercised genuine sovereign authority, probably as regent for her young son. Neith's tomb is remarkable in several respects. It is located in the royal cemetery at Abydos, the same cemetery that contains the tombs of the kings of the First Dynasty, including Jer-Jet, Den, and the other rulers whose names are inscribed on the Palermo stone and the other king lists that constitute the official chronology of the earliest dynasties. The tomb is surrounded by subsidiary burials, the graves of retainers who were interred alongside their ruler, a practice that was characteristic of the earliest royal burials, and that demonstrates the supreme status of the person for whom the main tomb was built. And the tomb is included in the royal sequence, listed alongside the tombs of kings in the official record, as if Neith were herself a king rather than a queen or a regent. The inclusion of Neith in the royal sequence is one of the most significant pieces of evidence for female sovereign authority in early dynastic Egypt. It suggests that the concept of the female ruler was not foreign to the earliest Egyptian state, that the idea of a woman exercising the kind of authority that was normally associated with the king was neither impossible nor unthinkable, but was, under the right circumstances, perfectly acceptable. The circumstances in this case were probably the minority of a young king, the death of King Jet leaving his son Den too young to rule, and his mother Neith stepping in as regent to govern the state until her son was old enough to assume the throne. The regency was not merely tolerated, it was recorded, it was memorialized, it was inscribed in the official record of the dynasty, with the same care and prominence that was given to the reigns of the male kings. The second exploration examines the tomb at Naqada itself, the physical structure that is our primary evidence for Neithhotep's existence and status. The tomb is a mastaba, the flat-topped rectangular structure that was the standard form of elite burial in early dynastic Egypt. The word mastaba comes from the Arabic for bench, a description that captures the shape of these structures as they appear from the outside. Low, flat-top rectangles of mud brick that rise from the desert surface like enormous benches, but the exterior appearance belies the complexity of the interior. The tombs contain multiple chambers, connected by corridors and separated by walls, each designed to hold specific categories of offerings and grave goods. The construction of a mastaba of the size of Neithhotep's tomb was a major engineering project, requiring the manufacture and transportation of hundreds of thousands of mud bricks, the excavation of subterranean chambers, the construction of walls and partitions, and the organization of a labor force that may have numbered in the hundreds. The scale of the tomb raises questions about the nature of Neithhotep's authority. Who authorized the construction? Who mobilized the labor? Who allocated the resources? The bricks, the timber, the stone vessels, the ivory, the food and drink that were placed in the tomb as offerings. These questions cannot be answered with certainty, but the scale of the investment suggests that the tomb was a state project, authorized and funded by the central administration of the newly unified Egyptian state. The state was investing its resources in the burial of a queen. The investment was not small. It was monumental, comparable in scale to the burial of a king and exceeding in size many of the royal tombs that would be built in later centuries. The state was making a statement, and the statement was clear: this woman mattered. The third exploration concerns the goddess Neith, the deity whose name Neithhotep bore and whose cult provides essential context for understanding the queen's identity and significance. Neith was one of the oldest deities in the Egyptian pantheon, a goddess whose origins may predate the unification of Egypt and whose cult was centered in the delta city of Sais. She was a goddess of many aspects: war and hunting, weaving and creation, wisdom and cosmic order. She was depicted as a woman wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt or carrying a shield and crossed arrows, symbols that connected her to the military traditions of the Delta and to the political identity of the Northern Kingdom. Her cult was ancient, so ancient that the Egyptians themselves considered her among the primordial deities, a goddess who had existed before the world was created and who had participated in the act of creation itself. The connection between Neithhotep and the goddess Neith is significant on multiple levels. On the most obvious level, the name establishes Neithhotep's geographic and political origins. She came from the north, from the delta, from the region where Neith was worshipped as the primary deity. On a deeper level, the name establishes a theological connection between the queen and the goddess, a connection that conferred divine legitimacy on the bearer, and that placed her under the protection of one of the most powerful deities in the Egyptian religious system. On the deepest level, the name may reflect a specific religious role. Neithhotep may have served as a priestess of Neith, or she may have been identified with the goddess in the same way that later Egyptian queens were identified with Isis, Hathor, or Mut. The evidence does not allow us to distinguish between these possibilities with certainty, but the name itself, Neith is satisfied, suggests a relationship of intimacy and mutual obligation between the queen and the goddess that goes beyond mere naming convention. The third exploration concerns the goddess Neith and what her cult reveals about the religious landscape of the earliest Egyptian state. Neith was one of the most ancient deities in the Egyptian pantheon, a goddess whose origins may predate the unification of Egypt by centuries, and whose cult was centered in the delta city of Sais, one of the most important political and religious centers of Lower Egypt. She was a goddess of extraordinary and multifaceted complexity, associated simultaneously with war and weaving, with hunting and creation, with the protection of the dead and the birthing of the living. She was depicted wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, the flat-topped crown with the distinctive protruding curl that was the symbol of northern sovereignty, or carrying a shield and a pair of crossed arrows, the implements of war that were her most recognizable iconographic attributes. Her cult was ancient, so ancient that even the Egyptians of later periods regarded her as one of the primordial deities, a goddess who had existed before the creation of the world and who had participated in the act of creation itself. The connection between Neithhotep and the goddess Neith operates on multiple levels and reveals the complexity of early Egyptian religious and political thought. On the most straightforward level, the name establishes geographic origin. Neithhotep came from the delta, from the region where Neith was worshipped as the principal deity. The name was a marker of identity, a declaration that this woman belonged to the religious and political traditions of the north, and that her presence in the south, in the heartland of the Upper Egyptian kingdom, was the result of a deliberate political act rather than an accident of birth. The name told everyone who heard it or read it where Neithhotep came from and what tradition she represented. It was, in the most literal sense, a statement of political allegiance, a declaration that the queen of the unified state maintained her connection to the northern goddess, even as she took her place beside a southern king. On a deeper level, the name establishes a theological relationship between the queen and the goddess, a relationship of patronage, protection, and mutual obligation that conferred divine legitimacy on the bearer. In the Egyptian religious system, the relationship between a person and their patron deity was not merely symbolic. It was real, a bond that connected the individual to the divine order and that placed the individual under the protection of the goddess whose name they bore. Neithhotep was protected by Neith. Neith was satisfied by Neithhotep. The relationship was reciprocal. The queen honored the goddess through her name, her devotion, and presumably her material support of the cult, while the goddess protected the queen through her divine power. The name was not merely a label. It was a covenant, a permanent declaration of the relationship between the human and the divine that would persist through life and death and into the afterlife. The political significance of this theological relationship should not be underestimated. In the context of the unification, the merging of Upper and Lower Egypt into a single state, the presence of a queen whose name invoked the principal goddess of the north was a powerful symbol of reconciliation and integration. The queen embodied the union of the two lands in her own person, carrying the religious traditions of the north into the court of the south, maintaining the worship of the Delta goddess in the heartland of Upper Egyptian power, and demonstrating through her very presence that the unified state honored both religious traditions equally. Neithhotep was not merely a diplomatic bride. She was a religious ambassador, a living symbol of the theological reconciliation that accompanied and legitimized the political unification. The cult of Neith would remain important throughout Egyptian history, from the earliest dynasties through the Ptolemaic period and beyond. The goddess evolved over the millennia, acquiring new attributes, new associations, and new forms of worship, but she never lost her fundamental identity as one of the most ancient and most powerful deities in the Egyptian religious system. The later Greeks identified her with Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, and the city of Sais, where her cult was centered, became one of the most important religious sites in late-period Egypt. The endurance of Neith's cult across 3,000 years of Egyptian history provides a frame of reference for Neithhotep's own story, a reminder that the religious tradition in which the queen was embedded was not a minor or ephemeral cult, but one of the deepest and most persistent strands of Egyptian religious life. The fourth exploration takes us to the question that has haunted this entire series, the question of what survives and what is lost and why. The fourth exploration takes us to the question that has haunted this entire series, the question of what survives and what is lost and why. Neithhotep's story is, in one sense, the most complete story in this series, because it is the simplest. We know her name, we know the location and the approximate date of her tomb, we know the nature and the quality of her grave goods, we know her probable connection to the political process of unification, and that is essentially all we know. The story is complete because there is nothing more to tell, no biography to reconstruct, no political career to trace, no literary legacy to analyze, no military campaigns to document. The record gives us a name, a tomb, and a handful of inscribed objects. Everything else, the woman, the life, the daily experience of being Neithhotep, is lost. But here is the problem. The loss is not the same kind of loss that we have documented in the other episodes of this series. The other queens, Hatshepsut, Tawosret, Tia-Mereniset, Cleopatra, Berenice, Arsinoe, lived in periods when the recording system was fully developed, when the hieroglyphic script was capable of recording extended narratives, when the administrative apparatus of the state was capable of producing and preserving detailed records of royal activities. The information about these queens was available, it existed, and it was lost through chiseling, through silence, through narrative distortion, through abstraction, through institutional absorption. The loss was active. It happened to information that had once existed and that was then destroyed, ignored, distorted, or absorbed. Neithhotep's loss is different. The information was never created in the first place. The writing system was not yet capable of recording the kind of biographical detail that later periods would produce. The administrative apparatus was not yet sophisticated enough to generate the detailed records that would characterize the mature Egyptian state. The recording conventions that would later preserve the names, titles, and achievements of royal women. Conventions that were themselves imperfect and biased, but that at least preserved something, had not yet been established. Neithhotep's silence is not the silence of erasure. It is the silence of the beginning. The silence that exists before the recording system is fully operational, before the technology of memory has been developed to the point where it can capture and preserve the kind of information that we would need to reconstruct a life. The question of what survives from Neithhotep's world is a question about the nature of archaeological evidence itself, about what the ground preserves and what it destroys, what the desert protects and what the centuries consume. The answer is both more and less than we might expect. More, because the dry climate of Upper Egypt is extraordinarily favorable to the preservation of organic materials, ivory, wood, leather, textile fibers, and even food offerings that would have decomposed within years in a wetter climate can survive for millennia in the arid conditions of the Egyptian desert. Less, because the earliest tombs were built of mud brick rather than stone, and mud brick, however well constructed, is vulnerable to the slow erosion of wind and sand and the occasional catastrophic flood that can destroy, in an hour, what 5,000 years of dry preservation had maintained. The objects recovered from Neithhotep's tomb, the stone vessels, the ivory labels, the seal impressions, the ceramic jars, represent a fraction of what was originally placed in the chambers. Many objects have been lost to the deterioration of organic materials, to the collapse of mud brick walls, to the activities of ancient tomb robbers who entered the chambers in antiquity and removed the most valuable portable objects, and to the imperfect methods of 19th century excavation that sometimes failed to recognize or recover the most fragile and most informative artifacts. The archaeological record from the earliest dynasties is, in this sense, a survivor's record, a collection of objects that happen to survive the combined destructive forces of time, climate, human interference, and archaeological methodology, and that therefore represents not the totality of what was originally present, but only the portion that was durable enough, lucky enough, and recognizable enough to make it through 5,000 years of attrition. Despite these limitations, the surviving objects are remarkably informative. The stone vessels demonstrate the extraordinary level of craft skill available to the early dynastic elite. The ability to work hard stones like diorite and basalt into thin-walled, symmetrical, polished vessels required techniques that were the product of centuries of development and that represented some of the most advanced manufacturing technology of the ancient world. The ivory labels demonstrate the existence of a system of notation, a proto-writing system that was capable of recording names, titles, and the identities of specific offerings with enough precision to be legible to modern scholars 5,000 years later. The seal impressions demonstrate the existence of an administrative system, a bureaucracy, however rudimentary, that used seals to mark ownership, authenticate documents, and control access to stored goods. The objects collectively paint a picture of a society that was already remarkably sophisticated in its technological capabilities, its administrative organization, and its religious practices, a society that was, in many ways, more advanced than the popular imagination gives it credit for. The Narmer palette, the famous ceremonial object that is widely interpreted as a commemoration of the unification of Egypt, provides an indirect but potentially significant context for understanding Neithhotep's role. The palette depicts King Narmer in two registers, on one side wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt and smiting a defeated enemy, on the other side wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt and inspecting the bodies of decapitated prisoners. The imagery is military and triumphalist. It presents the unification as a conquest, a victory of the south over the north, achieved through the application of overwhelming military force. But the palette also includes elements that suggest a more complex story, including the famous images of intertwined serpapard beasts whose entwined necks have been interpreted as symbols of the union of the two lands, and a procession of standards and attendants that may represent the administrative apparatus of the newly unified state. Neithhotep does not appear on the Narmer palette, or if she does, she has not been identified among the figures depicted. But her existence is part of the story that the palette tells. The unification was not achieved by military force alone. It was achieved through a combination of conquest and diplomacy, of warfare and marriage, of violence and alliance. The Narmer palette shows the military dimension of this process. Neithhotep's tomb shows the equally important diplomatic dimension, the strategic marriage between a southern king and a northern princess that sealed the alliance between the two lands and that produced the heirs who would continue the unified dynasty. The palette and the tomb are two sides of the same story, the story of how Egypt was created, of how two lands became one, and of how both male and female members of the ruling elite contributed to the process of unification. The relationship between the palette and the tomb also illustrates the broader dynamic between the recording of male and female contributions to the founding of the state. The Narmer palette is one of the most famous and most studied objects in all of Egyptian archaeology. It is displayed prominently in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. It appears in virtually every textbook on Egyptian history. It is used in countless lectures, documentaries, and popular accounts of the origins of Egyptian civilization. Neithhotep's tomb is, by comparison, almost unknown, mentioned only in specialist publications, discussed in narrowly focused academic journals, but absent from the mainstream narrative of Egyptian origins that shapes public understanding of how the civilization began. The disparity in public visibility and scholarly attention is not a reflection of the relative importance of the two artifacts. It is a reflection of the assumptions that shape the narrative. The assumption that the military dimension of the unification is the important dimension, the assumption that the king's story is the main story, and the assumption that the queen's contribution was merely secondary and peripheral rather than genuinely complementary and absolutely essential. The comparison between Neithhotep and the queens of later Egyptian history, the queens who have been the subjects of the preceding episodes in this series, illuminates the trajectory of women's visibility across 3,000 years of civilization with a clarity that individual case studies cannot achieve on their own. Each queen in this series represents a specific moment on the trajectory, a data point in the long arc that begins with Neithhotep's monumental tomb at Naqada, and that ends with the silence, distortion or absorption that consumed the later queens. By placing these data points in sequence, by tracing the line from Neithhotep through Hatshepsut, through Nefertari, through Tawasret, through Timereniset, through the Ptolemaic queens, the trajectory becomes visible, and the pattern of diminishment emerges from the individual stories, like a coastline emerging from the fog. Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt as pharaoh during the 18th dynasty, roughly 1,500 years after Neithhotep, represents a point on the trajectory where female power was still possible, but had become exceptional. Hatshepsut had to justify her rule in terms that the culture of her era demanded. She adopted the full titles and regalia of a male pharaoh. She was depicted in art with the masculine attributes of kingship, and she presented her authority through the theological framework of divine birth that connected her to the god Amun. The contrast with Neithhotep is revealing. Neithhotep, so far as we can tell from the limited evidence, did not need to adopt male attributes to justify her status. Her tomb was built to royal specifications without any apparent need for the kind of elaborate theological justification the Hatshepsut required. The earliest Egyptian state appears to have accepted female power as a natural feature of the political order, so natural that it did not require special justification. by Hatshepsut's time, 1500 years later, female power required elaborate justification, theological, ritual, and artistic, and even with that justification, it was subject to posthumous erasure by those who found it threatening. Nefertari, the great royal wife of Ramesses II, roughly 1300 years after Neithhotep, represents a point on the trajectory where female power had been redefined in terms of influence rather than authority. Nefertari was powerful. She was honored with the most beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Queens. She was associated with major diplomatic achievements, and she was celebrated in her husband's monumental inscriptions with a prominence that exceeded that of most Egyptian queens. But her power was derivative. It derived from her relationship to the king rather than from her own institutional position. She was powerful because Ramesses loved her. She was visible because Ramesses chose to make her visible. The contrast with Neithhotep is again revealing. Neithhotep's power, as evidenced by the extraordinary and unprecedented scale of her tomb and the prominence of her inscriptions, appears to have been institutional rather than personal, embedded in the structure of the state rather than dependent on the affections of a particular king. Tausret, who assumed pharaonic titles at the end of the 19th dynasty, roughly 1800 years after Neithhotep, represents a point where female sovereign authority was still possible but was treated as an aberration rather than a norm. Tausret's reign was followed by deliberate erasure. Her name was chiseled from the monuments, her tomb was usurped, and her memory was systematically obliterated by the dynasty that succeeded her. The erasure was not merely personal. It was institutional, a statement that female rulership was unacceptable, that it violated the norms of the Egyptian political order, and that it needed to be removed from the record to restore the proper functioning of the state. The contrast with Neithhotep is devastating. At the beginning, female power was accepted and honored. 1800 years later, it was tolerated briefly and then erased. The Ptolemaic queens, Arsinoe II, Berenice II, Cleopatra VII, represent the final phase of the trajectory, roughly 2800 years after Neithhotep. These queens wielded extraordinary power. They were deified, they appeared on coins, they influenced military and diplomatic policy, they governed kingdoms and fought wars. But their power operated within a system that, for all its apparent generosity toward female authority, was ultimately controlled by male rulers and male advisors who could remove a queen when she became inconvenient. Berenice was murdered, Arsinoe was absorbed, Cleopatra was destroyed by Rome and distorted by Roman propaganda. The system that appeared to empower women was, in the end, a system that controlled them, a system that could elevate a woman to the status of a goddess, and then discard the woman while preserving the goddess. The trajectory is clear. At the beginning, at the threshold, female power was structural, institutional, and apparently uncontested. By the end, it was conditional, contested, and subject to erasure by every mechanism that this series has documented. The distance between the beginning and the end is the measure of what was lost, and Neithhotep's tomb at Naqada is the permanent, physical, archaeological proof that the loss was real. The sixth exploration extends beyond Egypt to the broader question of what Neithhotep's existence tells us about women and the origins of civilization. The evidence from early dynastic Egypt is part of a larger pattern, a pattern that emerges from the archaeological records of the earliest civilizations across the globe, and that suggests that women played roles of significant political, religious, and economic importance in the earliest stages of state formation. The same pattern is clearly visible in ancient Mesopotamia, where the earliest temple economies were administered by both male and female religious officials, and where the goddess Inanna occupied a position of supreme importance in the Sumerian pantheon. It is visible in the Indus Valley, where female figurines are among the most common artifacts, and where the archaeological evidence suggests a society that gave significant prominence to female religious and possibly political authority. It is visible in Minoan Crete, where the frescoes and figurines and temple architecture suggest a remarkable civilization in which female religious authority appears to have been central and foundational to the entire social order, and where the concept of the male warrior king did not occupy the dominant position it would later hold in Greek civilization, and it is visible in predynastic and early dynastic Egypt, where the tombs of queens like Neithhotep and Neith demonstrate that women held positions of extraordinary status and possibly sovereign authority at the very beginning of the state. The pattern suggests something profound about the nature of early state formation, something that challenges the assumption, deeply embedded in Western historical thought, that political authority has always been primarily or exclusively male. The earliest states appear to have been more flexible in their distribution of political authority than the states that succeeded them, more willing to accommodate female leadership, more tolerant of female visibility in the public sphere, and more willing to invest state resources in the commemoration and honor of powerful women. The restriction of women's political authority, the development of conventions and institutions that limited women's access to power and reduced their visibility in the public record, was a later development, a product of institutional evolution rather than a feature of the original design. This does not mean that the earliest civilizations were egalitarian paradises in which men and women shared power equally. The evidence does not support such a conclusion, and the idealization of the distant past is as dangerous as its dismissal. What the evidence does support is a more nuanced conclusion, that the earliest civilizations granted women roles of significant public importance that were, over time, gradually restricted and marginalized as institutional structures became more complex, more bureaucratic, and more thoroughly controlled by male elites. The restriction was not universal, it was not uniform, it was not inevitable, but it was widespread, visible across multiple civilizations, multiple regions, and multiple millennia, and it produced, in every case, the same result: a recording system that was increasingly hostile to the preservation of women's achievements, and that systematically reduced the visibility of women in the historical record. The Indus Valley civilization provides a particularly instructive comparison because it represents a case where the recording system itself has been lost, where the script that the civilization used to record its information has never been deciphered, and where the evidence for women's roles must therefore be reconstructed entirely from material culture rather than from textual sources. The Hatshepsut script, the system of signs that appears on the thousands of seal impressions recovered from Indus Valley sites, remains one of the great undeciphered scripts of the ancient world, and its silence deprives us of the kind of textual evidence that, however biased and incomplete, provides at least some basis for reconstructing the political and religious roles of women in other ancient civilizations. The numerous female figurines that are among the most common and most distinctive artifacts of the Harappan civilization, small terracotta figures of women with elaborate headdresses and jewelry, suggest a religious system in which female power was prominently represented, but the absence of readable text makes it impossible to determine whether this representation translated into political authority of the kind that Neithhotep appears to have wielded. The comparison is relevant because it highlights the central paradox of the recording system, the paradox that this series has been exploring from its very first episode. The recording system preserves information, but it also filters information, preserving what the culture values and discarding what it does not. And the filter is not neutral. It reflects the assumptions, the priorities, and the biases of the culture that created it. The Indus Valley civilization had a recording system. The system has been lost, and because the system has been lost, we cannot reconstruct the roles of women in Harappan society with any confidence. The Egyptian civilization also had a recording system. The system has survived, but the system was biased. It preserved men's stories more thoroughly than women's, it documented men's achievements more prominently than women's, and it developed conventions that systematically reduced the visibility of women in the record. The result is that our knowledge of women's roles in Egyptian civilization is shaped not by what women actually did, but by what the recording system chose to document. And the recording system's choices were not neutral. The seventh exploration returns to the tomb itself, to the physical structure at Naqada that is the foundation of everything we know about Neithhotep. and the anchor of every argument we have made about her significance. The tomb has not been fully published. This fact, startling and dismaying to modern scholars, is itself a reflection of the institutional biases that have shaped the study of early dynastic Egypt. De Morgan's excavation in 1897 was conducted according to the standards of his era, standards that prioritized speed over thoroughness, that focused on the recovery of impressive objects rather than the systematic documentation of architectural features and spatial relationships, and that produced records that are, by modern archaeological standards, inadequate for a full understanding of the site. The tomb has not been re-excavated using modern methods, an ambitious project that would potentially yield enormous and transformative amounts of new information about Neithhotep, her burial, and the earliest period of Egyptian civilization. But that has not yet been undertaken for practical and institutional reasons that include the logistical challenges of working at the site, the competing institutional priorities of the archaeological organizations and government agencies that control access to it, and the simple fact that early dynastic queens have not been considered sufficiently important to warrant the investment of the resources that a modern excavation would require. The failure to re-excavate Neithhotep's tomb is itself a form of erasure, a modern form that operates not through chisels or silence or narrative distortion, but through the allocation of resources. Archaeological excavation is expensive. It requires funding, equipment, personnel, time, and institutional support. The decisions about which sites to excavate are therefore decisions about priorities, about which questions are considered important enough to warrant the investment of scarce resources. The fact that Neithhotep's tomb has not been re-excavated using modern methods reflects a set of priorities that has not yet placed the study of early dynastic queens at the center of the discipline, a set of institutional priorities that continues, in subtle, persistent, and often entirely unconscious ways, to privilege the study of male rulers and male achievements over the study of the women who stood beside them at the very foundation of the civilization. Neithhotep is the Egyptian baseline for this process. She is the evidence of what existed before the restriction began, the proof that the earliest Egyptian state honored its women with monumental burials and inscribed names, and possibly sovereign authority. And the distance between Neithhotep's tomb and the later queens of this series is the distance of the restriction, the measure of how much was lost, how much was diminished, and how much was forgotten as the recording system evolved from its inclusive beginnings into the selective and biased instrument it eventually became. The fifth exploration examines the broader question of what Neithhotep's existence tells us about the role of women at the foundation of human civilization, not just Egyptian civilization, but civilization in general. The evidence from early dynastic Egypt is consistent with evidence from other early civilizations. Evidence that suggests that women played roles of significant political and religious importance in the earliest stages of state formation, and that the systematic restriction of women's political authority was a later and culturally specific development, a product of institutional evolution rather than a feature of the original design. In Mesopotamia, the earliest temple economies were administered by both male and female religious officials, and the earliest Sumerian literature includes female deities of supreme power. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, who is one of the most important figures in the Sumerian pantheon, and whose myths describe a goddess of extraordinary agency and authority. In the Indus Valley, the female figurines that are among the most common artifacts of the Harappan civilization suggest a religious system in which female power was prominently represented, though the absence of deciphered writing makes interpretation difficult. In Minoan Crete, the archaeological evidence, the frescoes, the figurines, the temple architecture, suggests a remarkable civilization in which female religious authority appears to have been central and foundational to the entire social order. The pattern is suggestive. The earliest civilizations appear to have granted women roles of significant public importance, roles that were, over time, gradually restricted, redefined, and marginalized as institutional structures became more complex, more bureaucratic, and more thoroughly controlled by male elites. The restriction was not sudden or dramatic. It was painfully and almost imperceptibly gradual. A slow but relentless tightening of conventions and culturally embedded expectations that over centuries reduced the space available for women's public activity, and that transformed the recording systems from tools for documenting both men's and women's achievements into tools that increasingly documented men's achievements alone. Neithhotep stands at the beginning of this trajectory. She is the evidence of what was, the baseline against which the subsequent restriction can be measured, and the distance between Neithhotep's tomb at Naqada, a monument of female power built at the very foundation of Egyptian civilization, and the silence that surrounds the lives of later Egyptian queens is the measure of what was lost as the recording system evolved from its egalitarian beginnings into the biased and selective instrument it eventually became. The sixth exploration returns to the physical evidence, the objects found in Neithhotep's tomb, and what they tell us about the world she inhabited. The stone vessels are among the most impressive objects recovered from the tomb, carved from hard stones, diorite, basalt, and other materials that required specialized tools and extraordinary skill to work. The vessels represent some of the finest craftsmanship of the early First Dynasty. The creation of a stone vessel from a block of diorite or basalt was a process that required hours of patient work, drilling, grinding, polishing, using tools made of copper, flint, and abrasive sand. The finished vessels are objects of remarkable beauty, thin-walled, symmetrical, polished to a high luster, with proportions that suggest an aesthetic sensibility as refined as any that would be produced in later periods of Egyptian history. The presence of these vessels in Neithhotep's tomb testifies to the investment that the state was willing to make in her burial and to the value that the earliest Egyptian civilization placed on the honor of its queens. The ivory labels found in the tomb are, from a historical perspective, even more important than the stone vessels, because they bear the inscriptions that preserve Neithhotep's name and that provide the evidence for her identity and her relationships. The labels are small, typically just a few centimeters in each dimension, and they are inscribed with the earliest hieroglyphic signs, scratched or carved into the surface of the ivory with a sharp tool. The signs include the name Neithhotep, written in the conventional manner with the signs for the goddess, Neith, and the offering table, and they include other signs that identify specific offerings, record dates or events, and establish the relationships between the queen and other members of the royal house. The math is striking. More than 5,000 years separate Neithhotep's ivory labels from this documentary. The labels are among the oldest written documents in human history, objects that were inscribed at the very dawn of literacy, when the ability to create permanent written records was itself a genuinely revolutionary innovation in human communication, and they bear a woman's name. The first names written in Egypt include a queen's name. The threshold of literacy, the moment when human beings first acquired the ability to transmit information across time through the medium of written signs, includes, from the very beginning, the names of women. The tomb at Naqada is not merely an archaeological site. It is an argument made in mud brick and ivory and stone, an argument that has persisted for 5,000 years without being heard by most of the people who study the civilization it helped to found. The argument is devastatingly and beautifully simple. Women were here, women were powerful, women were honored, women were inscribed. The civilization that would later erase women's names began by inscribing them. The state that would later restrict women's authority began by granting it. The recording system that would later filter out women's stories began by including them. The beginning was different from the continuation, and the difference is the measure of what was lost. The argument has been made in mud brick for 5,000 years. It has been waiting, with the infinite patience of the desert, for someone to hear it. The argument is not complicated. Women were here at the beginning. Women helped build the civilization. Women fully deserve to be remembered and honored as its founders. Step back now from the tomb and the labels and the stone vessels and the scholarly debates. Step back from the specific story of Neithhotep, the queen at the threshold, the woman whose name is among the first written in all of Egyptian history. And look at what her story reveals about the deepest structures of memory, power, and the way civilizations choose to remember their beginnings. What does it mean to stand at the threshold? The threshold is the boundary between two worlds, the world of the unrecorded and the world of the inscribed. Before the threshold, there is silence. Not the silence of erasure, but the silence of absence, the silence that exists because the tools for recording information have not yet been invented. After the threshold, there is the record, fragmentary, biased, incomplete but real. The record can be lost, it can be destroyed, it can be distorted, but it exists, and its existence creates the possibility of memory, the possibility of preservation, the possibility that a name inscribed on an ivory label 5,000 years ago can be read by a person sitting in the present day and understood as the name of a real human being who once lived and breathed and walked the earth. Neithhotep crossed the threshold. She was among the first to cross it, and the fact that she crossed it, that her name was written, that her tomb was built, that her identity was preserved through 5 millennia of human history, is itself the most important thing about her. Not because her individual story is better documented than the stories of the other queens in this series, it is not. Neithhotep's story is the least documented of all, but because her existence at the threshold proves something that the rest of the series has been building toward. The proof that women were there at the beginning, that female power was real at the foundation, that the erasure that would follow, the chiseling, the silencing, the distorting, the abstracting, the absorbing, was a departure from the original condition rather than a continuation of it. Let that sink in. The implications are profound. If women were visible and powerful at the beginning of the Egyptian record, if the very first names inscribed in hieroglyphic script included the names of queens, then the subsequent erasure of women from the record was not inevitable. It was not natural. It was not a reflection of some eternal truth about the relationship between gender and power. It was a choice, a series of choices made over centuries and millennia by cultures and institutions and individuals who decided, consciously or unconsciously, that women's stories were less important than men's stories, that women's achievements were less worthy of permanent record than men's achievements, and that the recording system could afford to lose what women had contributed without suffering any meaningful damage to its accuracy or its completeness. The choice was wrong. The recording system did suffer damage, profound structural, irreparable damage from the loss of women's stories. The record that survives is not the full record of Egyptian civilization. It is a partial record, a record that preserves one side of the story while discarding the other, that documents the achievements of kings while ignoring or minimizing the achievements of queens, that maintains the names of men while losing the names of women. The partiality is not neutral, it distorts, it misleads. It creates the false impression that Egyptian civilization was built by men alone, that women were passive, marginal, decorative presences in a world that was shaped entirely by male agency and male ambition. The impression is false. The tomb at Naqada proves it is false. The inscription of Neithhotep's name proves it is false. The evidence from the earliest period of Egyptian history proves it is false. But the falseness of the impression does not prevent it from persisting. The impression persists because the recording system that created it is the only recording system we have. Because the evidence from the later periods, when the recording system was fully developed and capable of producing the detailed records that modern historians rely on, is the evidence that shapes our understanding of Egyptian civilization. The evidence from the threshold, from the earliest period, when the recording system was in its infancy and the conventions of gendered documentation had not yet been established, is too fragmentary, too ambiguous, and too difficult to interpret to serve as the foundation for a comprehensive alternative narrative. Neithhotep's name is written on ivory. It is not written in a textbook. Her tomb is in the desert. It is not in the popular imagination. Her story is in the scholarly literature. It is not in the cultural consciousness of a world that knows Cleopatra and Nefertiti, but cannot name a single queen from the First Dynasty. This is not science fiction. This is the actual condition of historical memory. A memory that is shaped not by what happened, but by what was recorded, not by the full range of human experience, but by the narrow and highly selective slice of that experience that the recording systems chose to preserve. The memory is partial, the record is biased, and the bias has persisted for 5,000 years, from the moment the recording system was created to the moment this documentary is being heard. The concept of the threshold has implications that extend beyond the specific case of Neithhotep to the broadest questions of historical epistemology, the study of how we know what we know about the past and why our knowledge is shaped the way it is. Every civilization has a threshold, a moment when the recording system begins to operate and the silence of the unrecorded past gives way to the fragmentary light of the inscribed record. And every threshold is shaped by choices, by decisions, conscious and unconscious, about what is worth recording and what can be left unrecorded, about whose names are inscribed and whose are forgotten, about which categories of human experience are preserved and which are allowed to disappear into the silence that precedes the record. The choices made at the threshold have consequences that persist for millennia because they establish the conventions, the categories, and the assumptions that all subsequent recording will follow. If the threshold includes women's names, as the Egyptian threshold did with Neithhotep, then the recording system begins with an inclusive orientation that may, if maintained, produce a record that reflects the full complexity of the civilization it documents. If the threshold excludes women's names, if the earliest records are exclusively concerned with male rulers, male achievements, and male experiences, then the recording system begins, instead, with a restrictive and exclusive orientation that will tend to perpetuate itself, producing a record that systematically underrepresents the contributions of half the population. The Egyptian threshold was inclusive. It included Neithhotep. It included Mer-Neith. It included the names and the burials and the institutional recognition of women who held positions of extraordinary power and prestige. The fact that the subsequent record became less inclusive, that the conventions evolved over 3,000 years in the direction of greater restriction and reduced visibility for women, is a historical development that requires explanation. It is not a natural or inevitable feature of the recording system. It is a cultural choice, or rather, a series of cultural choices made by many people over many generations. Each individual choice, small and seemingly insignificant and unremarkable in itself, but collectively producing a transformation that was profound and far-reaching. The modern study of Neithhotep and her contemporaries is therefore not merely an exercise in ancient history. It is an exercise in the archaeology of assumptions, a systematic excavation of the cultural biases and institutional conventions that have shaped our understanding of the past, and that continue, in subtle and often invisible ways, to shape our understanding of the present. The tomb at Naqada is evidence. The ivory labels are evidence. The seal impressions are evidence. But the most important evidence may be the assumptions that have prevented scholars from giving this evidence the significance it deserves, because the assumptions are themselves artifacts, cultural products of a tradition that has systematically undervalued women's contributions. And that requires the same kind of careful excavation and critical analysis that archaeologists bring to the physical remains and material culture of the ancient world. Let that sink in. The question of what was lost between the threshold and the later periods is not merely an academic question. It is a question about the nature of civilization itself, about the choices that societies make as they grow more complex, more powerful, and more bureaucratic. The evidence from the earliest period of Egyptian history suggests that the original distribution of power was more inclusive than the distribution that would later develop, that the earliest state made room for women at its apex in ways that later states would not. The question is, why? Why did the inclusive beginning give way to the exclusive continuation? Why did the civilization that honored Neithhotep with a royal tomb develop into the civilization that erased Hatshepsut's name from the stone? The answer is almost certainly related to the growth of institutional complexity. As the Egyptian state grew more complex, as the bureaucracy expanded, as the temple system became more elaborate, as the army became more professionalized, As the administrative apparatus required more specialized training and more hierarchical organization, the opportunities for women to participate in the exercise of power narrowed. The narrowing was not the result of a deliberate decision to exclude women. It was the result of a structural process, the development of institutions that were, by their nature, more restrictive than the informal arrangements they replaced. A chieftain's wife could share in the governance of a tribal community through personal influence and direct participation. A pharaoh's wife could not share in the governance of a bureaucratic empire in the same way. The bureaucracy required specialized training. The army required military experience. The temple system required priestly ordination. And none of these institutions were designed to accommodate women on equal terms. The process is visible in other civilizations as well. In Mesopotamia, the earliest temple economies included female administrators and priestesses who wielded significant institutional authority. But as the states of Sumer and Akkad grew more complex and more militarized, the opportunities for women to hold positions of administrative and religious authority gradually narrowed. In classical Athens, a society that is often held up as the birthplace of democracy, the women of the citizen class were systematically and thoroughly excluded from all forms of political participation, confined to the domestic sphere, and rendered invisible in the public life of the city, in ways that would have been incomprehensible to the women of Minoan Crete or early dynastic Egypt. The pattern is consistent across civilizations. The growth of institutional complexity tends to restrict women's access to power and to reduce women's visibility in the public record. But the pattern is not inevitable. It is a historical tendency, not an iron law, a historical trend rather than a structural necessity. The trend can be interrupted. It can be reversed. It can be countered by deliberate institutional design, by cultural choices that prioritize inclusion over restriction, and by recording systems that are designed to capture the full range of human achievement rather than the narrow slice that patriarchal conventions consider important. The fact that the trend has operated consistently across multiple civilizations and multiple millennia does not mean that it must continue to operate. It means that it is powerful. It means that it is persistent. But it does not mean that it is permanent. Neithhotep's tomb proves that the beginning was different from the continuation, and if the beginning was different, then the future can be different too. The modern world offers some grounds for cautious optimism. The recording systems of the 21st century are, in many respects, more inclusive than the recording systems of the ancient world, more capable of documenting women's achievements, more willing to recognize women's contributions, and more committed to the principle that the historical record should reflect the full complexity of human experience rather than the narrow perspective of a single gender. The progress is real and meaningful, but still profoundly incomplete. The biases of the ancient recording systems have not been entirely overcome. The conventions that prioritized male achievement over female achievement, that documented men's lives more thoroughly than women's, and that treated women's stories as peripheral rather than central. These conventions persist in subtler forms in the modern academy, the modern media, and the modern cultural consciousness. The work of correction is ongoing. It is not finished, and it may never be finished, because the forces that produce the erasure of women's stories are structural rather than personal, embedded in the institutions and the inherited conventions that shape our knowledge of the past, rather than in the individual choices of the scholars who study it. The evidence from Neithhotep's tomb is a corrective, a permanent, physical, archaeologically verified corrective to the assumption that women's political authority is a modern invention or a temporary aberration in the natural order of male-dominated civilization. The tomb proves that women held positions of extraordinary power and prestige at the very foundation of one of the most successful and most enduring civilizations in human history. The tomb proves that the subsequent restriction of women's authority was a departure from the original condition rather than a continuation of it, and the tomb challenges every assumption, every convention, and every institutional bias that has contributed to the erasure of women's stories from the historical record, because the tomb stands at the beginning, before the biases were established, before the conventions were formed, before the institutions that would later restrict women's visibility had been created. The grief moment of Neithhotep's story is not a single event, not a murder, not an exile, not a betrayal. The grief moment is the realization that the threshold was also a turning point, that the moment when women's names were first inscribed was also the moment when the system that would eventually erase women's names began to take shape. The writing system that preserved Neithhotep's name would become the writing system that failed to preserve the biographies of later queens. The recording conventions that documented her tomb with care and prominence would evolve into conventions that documented men's achievements more thoroughly than women's. The technology that began as a tool for preserving all that was important would become a tool for preserving only what the culture decided was important, and the culture would decide, gradually and cumulatively, and with devastating consistency, that women's stories were less important than men's. The series that this episode concludes has traced the full arc of women's visibility in the Egyptian record, from the threshold at which Neithhotep stands to the various forms of erasure that consumed her successors across 3,000 years. The arc is not a straight line of decline. It has peaks and troughs, periods of greater visibility and periods of lesser. But the overall trajectory, when viewed across the full span, is one of diminishment, a slow, irregular, but persistent reduction in the institutional prominence and documentary visibility of royal women. The reduction was produced not by a single cause but by a confluence of factors. The inexorable growth of bureaucratic complexity, the progressive militarization of the state, the development of theological frameworks that increasingly associated divine kingship with masculinity, and the evolution of recording conventions that prioritized male achievements over female achievements. Each queen in this series represents a specific moment on that arc and a specific mechanism of erasure. Neithhotep represents the baseline, the threshold at which women were visible and honored. Hatshepsut represents the chisel, the physical destruction of a woman's record by those who found her reign threatening. Nefertari represents the reduction of queenly power to personal influence dependent on a king's favor. Taosret represents the institutional rejection of female sovereignty. Meroneset represents the structural silence that comes from a recording system's indifference to women's lives. Cleopatra represents the narrative distortion that replaces a real woman with a fictional caricature. Berenice II represents the abstraction that preserves a name while dissolving the person. Arsinoe II represents the absorption that swallows an innovator inside her own innovation. Together, these stories constitute a comprehensive and devastating taxonomy of the specific mechanisms by which women's achievements have been systematically lost across 3 millennia of one of the greatest civilizations in human history. And Neithhotep, the earliest queen, the woman who stands at the threshold, the woman at the beginning, is the proof that the loss was not inevitable. She is the evidence that the starting condition was different from the ending condition, that the original foundation was considerably wider and more generous than the narrower structure that was subsequently built upon it, and that the systematic and cumulative erasure of women from the historical record was a departure from what was there at the start rather than a continuation of an original absence. The taxonomy is not merely a catalogue of individual injustices. It is a structural analysis, a systematic examination of the mechanisms by which patriarchal recording systems produce the erasure of women's achievements, regardless of the intentions or the personal values of the individual scribes, historians, and scholars who operate within those systems. The mechanisms are impersonal, they are institutional, they are embedded in the conventions of the recording systems themselves, in the formats that the inscriptions follow, in the categories that the administrative documents use, in the assumptions about what is worth recording, that shape every decision about what to inscribe and what to leave blank. The individual scribe may be perfectly well-intentioned. The individual historian may be committed to accuracy and fairness. But if the conventions within which they work are biased, if the formats prioritize men's achievements, If the categories exclude women's activities, if the assumptions about what is worth recording are shaped by patriarchal norms, then the output will be biased, regardless of the individual's intentions. The bias is systemic, and systemic bias can only be corrected by systemic reform, by changing the conventions, the categories, and the assumptions that produce the bias in the first place. This series has been, in its own way, an attempt at systemic reform, an effort to change the assumptions that shape the popular understanding of Egyptian history by telling the stories of the women who were there at every stage of the civilization's development and whose contributions have been systematically erased, distorted, or diminished by the recording systems that documented the civilization's achievements. The reform is incomplete. It will always be incomplete, because the evidence that was lost cannot be recovered, and the stories that were never recorded cannot be told. But the reform is real, it is genuine, and it begins, as all reforms must begin, with the recognition that the existing system is inadequate, that the historical record as it currently exists does not represent the full truth of the past, and that the sustained and deliberate effort to make it more complete, more accurate, and more representative is not merely a scholarly exercise, but a moral obligation. The threshold was not a door that opened into a brighter world. It was a door that opened into a world of partial light. A world where some stories would be preserved and others would be lost, where some names would endure and others would vanish, where the recording system would function as both a memory and a filter, preserving what it valued and discarding what it did not. Neithhotep walked through the door. Her name survived, her story did not, and the distance between the surviving name and the lost story is the distance that defines every queen in this series. The distance between what was and what we know, between the full reality of women's lives and the fragmentary record that is all we have. The foundation holds. Neithhotep's tomb is still in the ground at Naqada. The ivory labels are still in the museum cases. The name is still legible. Neith is satisfied, after 5,000 years of silence and sand and the slow and infinitely patient work of time. The foundation holds, because it was built at the threshold, at the moment when the recording system was new and the conventions were fresh and the institutional biases had not yet begun to accumulate. The foundation holds, because it was built before the long erosion started, and as long as that ancient foundation holds, the possibility of genuine and meaningful reconstruction remains open. The real and genuine possibility that the full and honest story of Egyptian civilization, including the stories of the women who helped to build it, can be painstakingly recovered from the fragments that the threshold preserved. Look at the ground beneath your feet. Wherever you are, in a city, in a town, in a village, in a house built on land that has been inhabited for generations or centuries or millennia, the ground beneath you holds the remains of the past. Layers of it, centuries of it, the foundations of buildings that were demolished to make way for newer buildings, the fragments of pottery from meals that were eaten and forgotten, the bones of people who lived and died and were buried and were themselves forgotten. The ground is an archive, a silent, impartial, comprehensive record of human habitation that is, in many ways, more complete and more honest than any written record, because the ground does not select. It does not filter. It does not decide which stories are worth preserving and which can be discarded. It preserves everything, impartially, indiscriminately, without the biases and the conventions that shape the written record. The tomb of Neithhotep is in that ground. It has been there for more than 5,000 years, buried beneath the sand of the Egyptian desert, its mud brick walls slowly eroding, its chambers filled with the debris of millennia, its inscriptions fading but not yet gone. The tomb is powerful and unambiguous evidence that a woman was honored at the foundation of Egyptian civilization, that her identity was preserved with the same care that was given to the identities of kings, that the earliest Egyptian state considered its queens worthy of monumental burial and permanent inscription. The evidence is there. It has always been there. It was there when de Morgan excavated it in 1897. It was there when the scholars debated Neithhotep's identity and her relationship to the earliest kings. It was there when the generations of Egyptologists who followed de Morgan failed to give the tomb the sustained attention its implications deserved. The physical evidence was there, present in the ground, recoverable through excavation, interpretable through careful analysis. But the assumptions were not. The assumption that political power is masculine. The assumption that monumental architecture reflects male authority. The assumption that the earliest civilizations were patriarchal in structure and that female power was, at best, an occasional exception to the rule, rather than a structural feature of the earliest political systems. These assumptions shaped the interpretation of the evidence, not by changing the evidence itself, but by determining what questions were asked of it, what significance was attached to it, and how it was integrated into the broader narrative of Egyptian history. The implications of Neithhotep's tomb extend far beyond the boundaries of Egyptology. They touch on the most fundamental questions about how civilizations begin, how power is distributed in the earliest stages of state formation, and how the recording systems that civilizations create shape the stories that those civilizations tell about themselves. The tomb strongly suggests that the earliest Egyptian state was substantially more inclusive of female power than the later Egyptian state would be, that the conventions and biases that would later restrict women's visibility in the historical record were not present at the beginning but were developed over time through the gradual evolution of institutional practices and cultural assumptions. The lesson is clear. The erasure of women from the historical record is not a natural or inevitable feature of human civilization. It is a cultural product, a consequence of specific choices made by specific cultures at specific moments in history. The choices were not always conscious, they were not always deliberate, but they were choices, and they could have been made differently. The civilization that built Neithhotep's tomb could have continued to honor its women with the same visibility and the same institutional prominence that it granted them at the beginning. It did not. The conventions changed, the assumptions shifted, the recording system evolved, and the women who had been visible at the threshold became invisible in the record, not because they ceased to exist or ceased to be important, but because the system that documented their existence ceased to consider them worthy of the same care and prominence it devoted to the documentation of men. The reversal of this process is the work of our generation, and of every generation that follows. The evidence is in the ground, the names are on the ivory, the tombs are in the desert. What is ultimately needed is not new evidence, but fundamentally new assumptions. A willingness to look at the evidence that already exists, and to see in it what the previous generations of scholars, shaped by their own cultural biases and institutional assumptions, failed to see. The willingness to ask, who built this tomb? Who was buried here? What does the size, the quality, and the prominence of this burial tell us about the role of women in the civilization that produced it? And why has the answer to these questions been so consistently overlooked, so persistently marginalized, and so thoroughly excluded from the mainstream narrative of human history? The implications of Neithhotep's existence extend to the modern world in ways that are both practical and philosophical. The practical dimension concerns the discipline of archaeology itself, the methods, the assumptions, and the interpretive frameworks that shape our understanding of the ancient past. De Morgan's assumption that Neithhotep's tomb belonged to a king was not merely a personal error. It was a systemic error, a product of an interpretive framework that associated monumental architecture with male power, and that was therefore structurally incapable of recognizing the evidence for female power that the archaeological record contained. The correction of this error, the identification of the tomb's occupant as a queen rather than a king, was not merely a factual correction, it was a methodological correction, a recognition that the assumptions of the interpreter shape the interpretation, and that biased assumptions produce biased interpretations, regardless of how carefully the physical evidence is excavated and recorded. The lesson is relevant to every field of historical inquiry, not just Egyptology but classical studies, medieval history, art history, and every other discipline that depends on the interpretation of fragmentary evidence from the past. The evidence does not speak for itself. It is always interpreted, filtered through the assumptions, the expectations, and the cultural biases of the interpreter. when those assumptions are biased, when they systematically associate certain kinds of achievement with certain kinds of people and systematically exclude others from the analytical framework, the resulting interpretations will inevitably be biased as well, regardless of how methodologically rigorous the methodology or how abundant the evidence. The correction of the bias requires not merely better evidence, but better assumptions, a willingness to question the frameworks within which the evidence is interpreted and to consider possibilities that the existing frameworks exclude. The philosophical dimension concerns the nature of memory itself, the relationship between what happened and what is at last being remembered, between the full complexity of human experience and the narrow slice of that experience that the recording systems preserve. Neithhotep's tomb reminds us that memory is not neutral, it is selective. It preserves what the culture values and discards what it does not. And the selectivity is not random. It follows patterns, it reflects assumptions, and it produces systematic biases that persist across centuries and millennia. The bias against women's stories is one of the most persistent and most consequential of these biases. A bias that has operated across multiple civilizations, multiple recording systems, and multiple millennia, producing a historical record that is dramatically less complete, less accurate, and less representative than it would be if women's stories had been preserved with the same care and the same prominence that the recording systems devoted to the stories of men. The ground beneath the Egyptian desert holds more than Neithhotep's tomb. It holds the tombs of countless unnamed women, women who lived and died in the centuries before and after the threshold, women who were never given monumental burials or inscribed labels, women whose existence is attested only by the physical remains of their bodies and the modest objects that were placed beside them in death. These women are the majority. They are the millions of unnamed individuals who constituted the population of the earliest Egyptian state. The farmers, the weavers, the mothers, the laborers, the unnamed women and men whose collective effort built the civilization that the recording system would document and that the modern world would study and admire. They are invisible not because they were unimportant, but because the recording system was not designed to document their lives. The recording system was designed for the elite, for the kings and queens and officials whose names and titles were considered worthy of permanent inscription. The vast majority of the population, male and female alike, was excluded from the record by design. But the exclusion was not equal. Among the elite, among the people whose lives the recording system was designed to document, the exclusion of women was more systematic and more persistent than the exclusion of men. Male officials were documented with their names, their titles, their achievements, and their genealogies. Female members of the elite were documented more sparingly. Their names recorded, their titles listed, but their activities and achievements documented with far less thoroughness and far less prominence than those of their male counterparts. The bias was embedded in the conventions of the system, in the categories that the scribes used, in the formats that the inscriptions followed, and in the assumptions about what was worth recording that shaped every decision about what to inscribe and what to leave blank. The reversal of this bias is not merely a scholarly project, it is a moral project, a recognition that the historical record as it currently exists is not the full record of human civilization, but a partial and distorted version of it, and that the distortion has consequences that extend beyond the academy to the broader culture. The stories we choose to tell about the past inevitably shape the expectations we hold for the future. A past in which women are invisible is a past that suggests women have always been invisible, that women's political authority is a modern anomaly rather than an ancient reality, that women's contributions to civilization are marginal rather than foundational, and that the restriction of women's public roles is natural rather than cultural. Neithhotep's tomb at Naqada directly and powerfully contradicts every one of these damaging suggestions. The tomb is evidence that women were present at the foundation. The tomb is evidence that women held positions of extraordinary power and prestige at the very beginning of civilization. The tomb is evidence that the beginning was different from the continuation, and that the continuation, not the beginning, is the anomaly that requires explanation. The questions are not difficult. The evidence is not hidden. The tomb is there. The name is there. The story is there, waiting as it has waited for 5,000 years to be told. Neithhotep's name is 5,000 years old. It has survived the rise and fall of the pharaohs, the conquest of Egypt by Persia, by Greece, by Rome, by the Arab armies of the 7th century, by the Ottoman Turks, by Napoleon, and by the British. It has survived the deterioration of the mud brick walls of her tomb, the looting of her grave goods, the imperfect excavation of her burial site, and the scholarly neglect that followed its discovery. The name has survived because it was inscribed, because someone, 5,000 years ago, took a sharp tool and pressed it into a piece of ivory and created marks that would outlast the civilization that produced them. The act of inscription was an act of faith, a belief that the marks would be read, that the name would be spoken, that the woman who bore the name would be remembered. The faith was justified. The name endures across the millennia, and the woman, however imperfectly, however incompletely, is at last being remembered. There is a tomb in the Egyptian desert near the ancient city of Naqada. It is more than 5,000 years old. It is roughly 53 meters long and 26 meters wide, larger than many of the royal tombs that would be built in later centuries by kings whose names are known to every student of Egyptian history. The tomb was excavated in 1897 by the French archaeologist Jacques de Morgan, a man of considerable archaeological experience and institutional authority, who assumed, naturally, inevitably, and wrongly, that it belonged to a king. It did not. It belonged to a queen. Her name was Neithhotep, and her name is one of the oldest female names in all of recorded human history. She lived at the threshold, the precise moment when the civilization we call ancient Egypt was being born. The Nile Valley and the Delta were being forged into a single state. The hieroglyphic script was being invented. The conventions of royal burial were being established for the first time. And a woman whose name invoked the goddess Neith of Lower Egypt, a woman whose tomb was built to royal specifications in the heartland of Upper Egypt, was at the center of it all. She may have been a princess from the Delta, married to a king from the south to seal the alliance that created the unified state. She may have been a regent, governing the newly united kingdom during the minority of a young king. She may have been both, a diplomatic bride who became a political ruler, a woman who bridged two lands and helped to create a civilization that would endure for 3,000 years. The world she inhabited was a world in the process of becoming, a world where the institutions of the state were being invented, where the conventions of royal power were being established for the first time, where the very concept of writing was new and its possibilities were still being explored. She did not inherit a finished system. She helped to create one. She was emphatically not the passive beneficiary of previously established conventions. She was part of the generation that established them. The tomb that was built for her, the enormous mastaba at Naqada, with its multiple chambers and its royal quality grave goods and its inscribed ivory labels, was not the product of an existing tradition of monumental queenly burial. It was one of the first expressions of that tradition, a monument that helped to define what a queen's burial should look like, and that set a standard of scale and elaboration that would influence, whether consciously or unconsciously, every subsequent generation of tomb builders. The ivory labels in her tomb are among the oldest surviving examples of Egyptian writing. Tiny objects inscribed with signs that represent the earliest attempts of the human mind to capture language in visible, permanent, transmissible form. The signs are pictographic, a falcon for Horus, crossed arrows for Neith, an offering table for Hotep, and they record names, titles, and the identities of offerings with a precision that was revolutionary for its time. The labels are small enough to hold in the palm of a hand, but what they represent is immense. The beginning of literacy, the threshold of recorded history, the extraordinary and transformative moment when human memory ceased to depend solely on the fragile and ephemeral medium of the spoken word, and acquired, for the first time, the capacity to outlast the speaker, and a woman's name is among the first things that this new technology recorded. We do not know the details of her life. We do not know what she thought or felt or experienced. We do not know the sound of her voice, or the shape of her face, or the texture of her daily existence. The recording system that preserved her name was not yet capable of preserving her story. The technology of memory was in its infancy. The hieroglyphic signs on the ivory labels in her tomb can tell us her name and her titles. They cannot tell us who she was, but they can tell us something more important than biography. They can tell us that she was there, that women were there, at the very foundation of Egyptian civilization, at the very threshold of recorded history, at the very moment when the tools for creating permanent human memory were being invented. Women were not added to the story later. They were not included as an afterthought. They were there from the beginning. Their names inscribed alongside the names of kings, their tombs built to royal specifications, their identities preserved with the same care and the same institutional commitment that was devoted to the preservation of male identities. Everything that followed, every act of erasure, every mechanism of forgetting, every form of diminishment that this series has documented across 3,000 years of Egyptian history was a departure from this beginning. The chiseling of Hatshepsut's name was a departure. The silence around Ty-Meren-Set was a departure. The narrative distortion of Cleopatra was a departure. The abstraction of Berenice into a constellation was a departure. The absorption of Arsinoe into her own institutions was a departure. Every form of erasure was a departure from the original condition. The condition that Neithhotep's tomb documents, the condition in which women were visible, honoured, and inscribed at the very foundation of the civilization that would later work so hard to make them invisible. The tomb is still there. The sand has covered it, and covered it again across the millennia. The mud brick walls have eroded under the assault of wind and sand, and the occasional flash flood, but they have not disappeared entirely. The chambers that held the offerings have been emptied by time and by archaeologists, their precious contents now scattered across museum collections and storage facilities in Cairo, London, Paris, and beyond. But the tomb endures. It endures as evidence. It endures as testimony. It endures as proof that the world began differently from how it continued, that the foundation included what the building would later exclude, that the threshold was wider than the door that followed it, that the beginning was more generous than the middle or the end. Neithhotep's name is written on ivory that is 5,000 years old. The name means Neith is satisfied. The goddess of war and weaving, of hunting and creation, looked at this woman and was satisfied. The civilization that was being born looked at this woman and was satisfied. The state that was being created looked at this woman and judged her worthy of royal burial, of inscribed identification, of permanent record. 5,000 years later, standing at the far end of a chain of human memory that stretches back to the very dawn of literacy, we look at this woman, across the vast distance of the millennia, across the accumulated silence of 100 generations, and we are not satisfied, not with the fragmentary nature of what has been preserved, not with the vast scale of what has been irretrievably lost, not with the distance between the tomb at Naqada and the silence that has consumed the stories of the queens who came after her. We are not satisfied with a recording system that began by inscribing women's names and ended by erasing them. We are not satisfied with a civilization that honoured its women at the threshold and forgot them on the journey. We are not satisfied, and the dissatisfaction is itself a form of remembering. The tomb is there, the name is there, the threshold is there. The boundary between silence and record, between prehistory and history, between the unnamed and the named. Neithhotep crossed that momentous boundary more than 5,000 years ago, and the fact that she crossed it, that she was named, that she was honoured, that she was inscribed, that she was remembered, is the foundation on which every act of recovery in this series has been built. Every queen in this series, every woman whose story we have told across these many hours of documentary, is connected to Neithhotep by the invisible thread of the recording system that the earliest Egyptian state created. The thread stretches from the ivory labels at Naqada to the temple walls at Deir el-Bahari, to the painted tomb in the Valley of the Queens, to the gold octadrachms of the Ptolemaic Mint, to the constellation that still shines above the Mediterranean. The thread is the record itself, the fragile, culturally biased, tantalizingly incomplete, but irreplaceable record that began at the threshold, and that has carried the names and the fragments of women's lives across 5,000 years of human history. The foundation holds, the name endured, and the silence that followed the threshold, the long, slow silence of 5,000 years of gradual erasure, has at last, after 5,000 patient and silent years, begun to break.